In the spring of 1933, when cherry blossoms painted Berlin's boulevards pink, and the world still believed Germany might recover its soul peacefully, 117 young men gathered in a Munich barracks to begin a transformation that would bind them to history's darkest chapter. They came as soldiers. They would become something else entirely, something for which our language still struggles to find adequate names. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. They called themselves the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. The very name carried weight. Leibstandarte, a term borrowed from medieval times when knights pledged their bodies as shields for kings. But these were no knights, and the man they would protect was no king, though he would demand the loyalty of both. Consider for a moment what it means to be chosen for such a role. Not merely to guard, but to become inseparable from the guarded. To tie your fate so completely to another human being that history cannot speak one name without eventually arriving at the other. Hans Bauer stood among those early recruits, though his path to Hitler's side had begun years earlier, in the crystalline air above the trenches of the Great War. He was a pilot, an ace, with 60 enemy aircraft credited to his name 60 times. He had looked through gun sights at another man's plane and pulled the trigger. 60 times he had watched fire bloom in the sky and known he had ended someone's story. The mathematics of combat had taught him a particular skill, the ability to act without drowning in the implications of action. This quality, this capacity to separate deed from meaning, would prove more valuable than any marksmanship in the years ahead. When Bauer first flew Adolf Hitler in 1932, he noticed something peculiar. His passenger sat absolutely still, hands folded, staring straight ahead, as if willing the aircraft to stay aloft through pure concentration. Most politicians Bauer had flown chattered nervously or attempted to impress him with false bravado. Hitler's silence was different. It carried intensity, a coiled spring quality that made the air inside the cockpit feel charged with electricity. "Can you fly lower?" Hitler had asked once, as they passed over the Bavarian countryside. "I want to see their faces." Even then, Bauer sensed something in the request that went beyond simple curiosity. His passenger wanted to see not just people, but the abstract made concrete. Power is nothing if it cannot be witnessed. In a different corner of that first Leibstandarte formation stood Rochus Misch, barely 22 years old, an orphan from Silesia, who carried the particular hunger of those who have never belonged anywhere. When you have no family to anchor you, you search for connection with an intensity that can make you vulnerable to exploitation. The recruitment notice had promised elite service, exceptional pay, and the chance to stand at the center of Germany's rebirth. For a young man who had spent his childhood in institutions, watching families through windows like someone pressing their face against the glass of a warm house in winter, the promise of belonging was intoxicating. Misch would later describe his first day in that Munich barracks with the precise memory trauma preserves. The way morning light slanted through high windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like snow, the smell of boot polish and gun oil and nervous sweat, the sound of 117 pairs of heels clicking together as their new commander entered. He remembered thinking, "I am part of something now. I am no longer alone." It's worth pausing here to recognize this moment for what it was, the beginning of a seduction. Belonging is among humanity's deepest needs, coded into our DNA from millennia of survival through cooperation. Those who manipulate this need hold devastating power. The selection process that winnowed thousands down to these 117 men operated through layers of criteria, each more revealing than the last. The official requirements seemed straightforward enough, even admirably rigorous. Minimum height, 5 feet 11 inches, well above the German average of 5 feet 7. This wasn't mere preference for tall men, it was theatre, the creation of a visual mythology. When these bodyguards stood in formation, they would tower over crowds, living monuments to the racial ideal National Socialism promised to cultivate. Every recruit submitted genealogical documents tracing their ancestry back to 1750. Imagine the work involved parish records examined, birth certificates collected, family trees mapped across generations. They were hunting for purity, for bloodlines untainted by what Nazi ideology classified as inferior. But beneath this, pseudo-scientific eugenics lurked something more insidious. By making men prove their ancestry, by forcing them to invest time and pride in this biological identity, the selection process began its psychological work before training even started. You cannot spend months constructing a family tree that proves your superiority without beginning to believe in that superiority. The investigation becomes its own indoctrination. Physical examinations followed that would not have been out of place in livestock shows. Doctors measured skull dimensions, calculating ratios between forehead height and jaw width. They examined teeth for alignment, eyes for clarity, posture for any hint of weakness. Karl Wilhelm Krauss, who would become Hitler's personal valet, remembered standing naked in a room of mirrors while 3 doctors walked circles around him, taking notes, occasionally asking him to demonstrate his physical fitness through push-ups or squats performed under their clinical gaze. The dehumanization was intentional. You break men down before building them into something new. But the physical and genealogical requirements were merely the visible portion of the selection process. Beneath the surface ran darker tests, trials designed to identify not just strong bodies and pure bloodlines, but particular qualities of mind and spirit, or rather, particular absences of moral boundaries. The first real test came during the Night of Long Knives in June 1934. Hitler, consolidating power, ordered the murder of Ernst Röhm and other SA leaders who had helped him rise but now threatened his absolute authority. Some of the Leibstandarte men participated directly in these executions, entering hotel rooms to kill men they had served alongside, sometimes worked with, certainly knew as human beings with names and families and histories. Others formed cordons, preventing escape, ensuring the night's bloody work could proceed uninterrupted. This was the crossing of a threshold. There exists a profound difference between violence in war, where distance and enemy status provide psychological insulation, and the murder of compatriots at close range. To kill a fellow German on command, without trial, without even the pretense of justice, requires either psychopathy or the suspension of individual moral judgment in favor of obedience. The men who could do this, who could pull triggers or thrust knives while looking into familiar faces, these were the men who passed through to the next level of selection. And here we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Most of them were not monsters. Psychological evaluations conducted after the war found no unusual prevalence of sadism or psychopathy among Hitler's bodyguards. They were, by most measures, ordinary men. Some had been schoolteachers, others had worked in their fathers' shops, several had been seminary students, preparing for lives in service to God before finding a different altar. Their capacity for evil did not stem from inherent darkness, but from something more terrifying, the human ability to compartmentalize, to follow orders, to gradually accept the unacceptable when acceptance comes in small enough increments. By 1940, those who remained in the inner circle had passed through a series of moral checkpoints, each one normalizing the next, like a diver descending into deep water, adjusting to pressure gradually until you swim at depths that would have killed you if reached too quickly. They had guarded party rallies where rhetoric turned crowds into weapons. They had stood silent while policies transformed neighbors into non-persons. They had witnessed the machinery of exclusion and persecution humming to life, and they had chosen again and again to remain. Karl Wilhelm Krauss's story illuminates how thoroughly ordinary life became entangled with evil's administration. As Hitler's personal valet, Krauss's duties included the mundane intimacies of service, laying out clothes, polishing shoes, ensuring the Führer's uniforms hung properly, and his personal effects were arranged to precise specifications. These are tasks that exist in every privileged household, activities so normal they seem almost boring. But Krauss also became keeper of secrets that weighed like stones in his chest. He knew about Geli Robal, Hitler's niece, whose death in Hitler's Munich apartment in 1931 was officially ruled suicide, but left questions that authorities never investigated with any rigor. Krauss had seen the relationship, witnessed the possessive intensity with which Hitler monitored his young niece's activities, controlled her social life, displayed jealousy that crossed boundaries propriety should have enforced. When Gelly died from a gunshot wound to the chest, Kraus was among those who helped clean the apartment, who made certain calls, who ensured the story remained simple. A troubled young woman, a tragic choice, nothing more to see. This is how complicity works, not through grand decisions, but through small participations, each one logical in isolation, all of them combining into something monstrous. Kraus likely told himself he was simply doing his job, being loyal to his employer, not making waves. And with each small compromise, the next became easier, until the distance between who he had been and who he had become was so vast he could no longer see across it. The bodyguards existed in a golden cage of privilege that both rewarded their service and ensured their silence. They earned 5 times the salary of standard soldiers, enough to marry well, buy homes, support families in comfort, while much of Germany struggled through economic recovery. They ate food common citizens only dreamed of, fresh meat when others made do with turnips, real coffee while ersatz brews filled most cups, French wines and Swiss chocolates that appeared on their tables as if by magic. This privileged status served multiple purposes. It created gratitude and debt. How could you turn against those who provided such bounty? It demonstrated the rewards of loyalty to others watching from outside the inner circle, and perhaps most importantly, it constructed a material barrier between the bodyguards and ordinary reality. When you eat well while others starve, when you live in comfort while others suffer, you must either acknowledge your complicity or build psychological walls between yourself and those less fortunate. Most chose the walls, but the privileges came with prices that money couldn't measure. Every bodyguard signed documents upon recruitment that made the terms explicit, speaking about their duties, revealing any detail of Hitler's private life or protective security, discussing anything they witnessed or overheard. All of these carried automatic execution sentences. Not trial and execution, not imprisonment, then execution, simply execution, swift and certain, extended even beyond the praise. If Germany lost and the bodyguards survived, they remained bound by these oaths on pain of death. They had signed away their voices, selling their silence for security and salary. This contractual muzzling served to deepen their investment in the regime's survival. Your freedom becomes tied to your oppressor's success. If Hitler fell, the bodyguards faced imprisonment, trial, execution by his enemies. Their only path to continued life and liberty ran through the man they protected. This alignment of interests transformed simple bodyguards into something more visceral, living shields who protected not just from external threats, but from the truth itself. As war approached, the daily reality of service intensified. The bodyguards worked in rotating shifts, never knowing which hours they might be called upon, unable to plan lives that extended beyond Hitler's needs. Some married the regime encouraged it, wanting to demonstrate that SS men were family builders, not mere warriors. But these marriages existed under strain. Wives learned not to ask where their husbands had been. Children grew up sensing secrets that filled rooms like invisible smoke. Johann Rattenhuber, who would rise to command the entire personal protection apparatus, developed protocols that turned Hitler's security into a consuming obsession. Every route was scouted days in advance. Every building Hitler would enter was searched room by room, with bodyguards checking behind furniture, inside closets, under floorboards. Every person who would come within 50 meters of the Führer was investigated, their backgrounds examined, their associations mapped, their loyalty verified through channels that extended into the Gestapo's vast network. The work was simultaneously vital and soul-crushing. Vital because the threats were real assassination. Attempts would eventually number in the dozens, some coming within meters or minutes of success. Soul-crushing because the protection of one man consumed resources, time, and human lives that might have been spent on anything else. Every bodyguard knew that soldiers at the front died in part because equipment and personnel were diverted to protective details. This knowledge created its own cognitive burden. How do you maintain that your work matters more than defending your nation's borders? As our first chapter closes, we stand on the edge of what these men would become. They have been selected, tested, bound by oaths and privileges, transformed through incremental compromises from citizens into instruments. They do not yet know, cannot yet imagine the depths to which their service will eventually take them. But the machinery of their transformation is already in motion, grinding forward with the inevitability of gears once engaged. Tomorrow, we will enter the wolf's lair, that fortress of paranoia where security became its own form of madness. We will see how protection transformed into prison, how the machinery, meant to preserve one life, consumed thousands. The story darkens from here, as it must, but understanding how ordinary men became extraordinary servants of evil, this understanding remains our best defense against history's repetition. The cherry blossoms of 1933 have long since fallen. The young men who stood in that Munich barracks are gone, their stories preserved only in documents and fading memories. But the patterns they illuminated, the seductions of belonging, the power of incremental compromise, the terrible things humans can accept when acceptance arrives. Gradually, these patterns remain active in our world, waiting for the conditions that might call them forth again. We remember not to condemn, though condemnation is deserved. We remember to understand, because understanding is the only tool that might prevent recurrence. These were men who chose wrong at every crossroads, who traded conscience for comfort, who decided that personal security mattered, more than collective humanity. But they were human. That's what makes their story both tragic and terrifying. Not that monsters walked among us, but that we all carry within us the capacity to become them, given the right pressures, the right promises, the right sequence of small surrenders. The Bodyguard's transformation has only begun. The descent continues tomorrow. Every morning at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, hidden in the forests of East Prussia, 15 young women arrived to perform a ritual that stripped away any remaining innocence about the nature of power. They were food tasters, recruited from the surrounding villages, told they were serving the fatherland through this simple act of eating before the Führer ate. Margot Volk, one of these women who survived to tell the story decades later, described the experience with a clarity that trauma often preserves. Before we continue, if you're finding value in this journey through history's darkest corridors, share this with someone who needs to understand how tyranny builds itself. Tomorrow's chapter reveals what these men witnessed and what they chose to ignore. They would sit at a long wooden table in a room without windows, plates of food arranged before them. Everything was vegetarian. Hitler's preference dictated their menu. Cauliflower prepared 7 different ways, potatoes roasted, mashed, and fried, salads dressed with oils they couldn't identify. The food was excellent, the best many of them had eaten in years of wartime rationing. But excellence meant nothing when you understood you were a living test, a canary in a coal mine made of flesh and fear. After eating, they waited. 45 minutes by the clock on the wall, each tick a small eternity. If the food was poisoned, symptoms would appear in that window of time. Margot Volk remembered crying after meals, tears of relief that she had survived another day, mixed with horror that tomorrow she would return, do it all again. She never learned the names of the other women. Knowing names would have made it worse, would have required acknowledging their shared terror as something more than duty. They existed in parallel isolation, each woman locked inside her own fear, while surrounded by others experiencing the identical nightmare. This was the reality at the center of Hitler's protection, not courage or loyalty, but fear multiplied through every layer of the security apparatus, until it became the very air everyone breathed. Consider what it means to build a world where 15 women must risk death daily, so that one man can eat without worry. The disproportion itself reveals the sickness at the system's heart. The protection apparatus that surrounded Hitler operated through 3 concentric rings, each with its own protocols, its own commanders, its own carefully maintained boundaries. Understanding this architecture is essential to grasping how security became indistinguishable from imprisonment, how the machinery meant to preserve life instead consumed it. The outer ring consisted of regular SS troops, several hundred men who patrolled perimeters, checked documents, maintained the illusion of normal military operations. These soldiers knew they guarded something important but remained removed from the inner sanctum's reality. They saw Hitler as a distant figure, glimpsed occasionally through car windows or across parade grounds. Their service was impersonal, their connection to the man himself abstract enough to allow moral distance. The middle ring belonged to the Reich Security Service, the Reichssicherheitsdienst, professionals trained in counterintelligence and threat assessment. These men investigated potential dangers, tracked suspicious individuals, coordinated with the Gestapo to neutralize threats before they materialized. They knew details about assassination plots, about the networks of resistance that never stopped trying to reach Hitler despite the failures that marked their attempts. This knowledge gave them power and burden. Simultaneously, they saw the hatred that surrounded the Führer, understood at least intellectually why so many wanted him dead, yet their role required preventing those deaths rather than permitting them. But the innermost ring, the personal bodyguards who never left Hitler's side, these men existed in a different reality entirely. They knew his moods, his habits, his fears. They saw him without the public mask, watched him pace in the middle of the night, listened to his rambling monologues about destiny and providence. Johann Rattenhuber commanded this elite group, and under his leadership, protection transformed into an obsession that bordered on madness. Rattenhuber had served in the Bavarian police before joining the Nazi apparatus, bringing with him a methodical mind that saw threats in every shadow, danger behind every smile. He was not a fanatic in the ideological sense former colleagues described him as pragmatic, almost bureaucratic in his approach to security. But this pragmatism, applied to protecting a dictator, produced protocols that were simultaneously brilliant and horrifying in their thoroughness. Travel provides the clearest window into the system's complexity. When Hitler moved between locations from Berlin to the Berghof, from Munich to the Wolf's Lair, the operation involved not one train but three, running parallel routes calculated to confuse potential assassins. Hitler would board one train, then, at a predetermined point determined by dice rolls, yes, actual dice, chance introduced into the equation to prevent pattern recognition, he would switch to a different train. The empty trains continued their journeys, drawing attention and resources away from the actual route. Inside the train carrying Hitler, bodyguards occupied every compartment adjacent to his, weapons loaded, eyes scanning the landscape that blurred past windows. Rattenhuber insisted on speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour when possible, fast enough that a shooter attempting to hit a moving target would face nearly impossible odds. When the train stopped at stations, local police surrounded the platform in triple cordons, and snipers took positions on rooftops, with orders to shoot anyone who moved suspiciously, where suspicious could mean running, reaching into a coat, or simply being in the wrong place when the Führer's train arrived. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, illustrated how security requirements transformed architecture itself. On the surface, it appeared to be simply a large alpine house, elegant in its proportions, positioned to command spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. But beneath this pleasant exterior lay 7 miles of tunnels, an underground city designed to protect its single inhabitant from every conceivable threat. These tunnels connected defensive positions, allowing bodyguards to move, unseen from one location to another, to reinforce areas under threat without exposing themselves to observation or fire. Storage rooms held enough food, water, and ammunition to sustain a siege of months. Ventilation systems, designed by engineers who had built submarine air processors, ensured fresh air even if the surface became contaminated. Emergency exits emerged at locations mapped only by Rattenhuber and his most trusted deputies, escape routes that would function if everything else failed. The cost of building this subterranean fortress exceeded the annual budget of most German cities. Workers who constructed the tunnels were transferred to other projects far from Bavaria once their work was complete, ensuring knowledge of the layout remained restricted. Some of these workers later disappeared entirely, eliminated by the Gestapo as potential security risks. Even the bodyguards themselves knew only the sections relevant to their duties. Compartmentalization extended to those within the system, preventing any single individual from possessing complete knowledge that might be extracted under torture or offered in betrayal. November 13th, 1939, marked a turning point in the evolution of Hitler's security, the moment when paranoia that might have seemed excessive became retrospectively justified. Georg Elser, a carpenter from Württemberg, spent 30 nights hollowing out a pillar in Munich's Bürgerbräukeller, the beer hall where Hitler gave an annual speech commemorating the failed putsch of 1923. Elser worked with a jeweler's precision, installing a time bomb powered by clock mechanisms he had built himself. Set to detonate at 9:20 in the evening when Hitler would be mid-speech, surrounded by Nazi leadership. The bomb worked perfectly. It exploded exactly on schedule, destroying the pillar and bringing down the ceiling in a cascade of timber and plaster that killed 8 people and injured 63 others. But Hitler had left the hall 13 minutes earlier, departing ahead of schedule because fog threatened to ground his flight back to Berlin and he chose to take a train instead. 13 minutes, a weather-driven schedule change. The narrowness of his escape was measured in seconds, and the thickness of fog. When Rattenhuber learned of the assassination attempt, he was with Hitler on the train. When the news arrived, he reportedly vomited from the shock of how close they had come to failure. His entire career, all his protocols, the layers of security he had so carefully constructed, none of it had prevented a lone carpenter from nearly succeeding where intelligence agencies and resistance networks had failed. The lesson Rattenhuber extracted was not that such attempts were inevitable and prevention impossible, but rather that security measures needed to multiply, to intensify, to become so comprehensive that no Georg Elser could ever again come within 13 minutes of success. The changes that followed transformed Hitler's world into something resembling a prison whose walls existed not to keep the occupant in but to keep everyone else out. Windows throughout all Hitler's residences were replaced with bulletproof glass 11 centimeters thick, glass so heavy that frames required reinforcement and walls needed structural support to bear the weight. Looking through this glass, the world appeared slightly distorted, colors shifted, perspectives subtly wrong. Hitler spent the last 6 years of his life viewing reality through this thick barrier, a metaphor almost too perfect to require explanation. Every gift received by Hitler, and he received thousands, from admirers, diplomats. Foreign leaders underwent X-ray examination using equipment commandeered from hospitals that desperately needed it to treat wounded soldiers. Packages were opened in special rooms by technicians wearing protective gear, manipulating contents with tools designed to trigger explosive devices from safe distances. Rattenhuber kept records showing that in 1944 alone, 17 gifts sent to Hitler contained various forms of booby traps, bombs, or poison. None reached their target, but their existence confirmed his paranoia as prescience. Even Eva Braun, Hitler's companion, who would eventually become his wife in the bunker's final hours, could not escape the security apparatus. Despite her intimate relationship with the Führer, despite years of closeness that made her presence a constant in his private life, she underwent searches before entering his quarters. Female SS auxiliaries examined her makeup. Could lipstick conceal poison that might be transferred through a kiss? They checked her clothes for hidden weapons, inspected her shoes for modified heels that might contain blades or needles. She submitted to this ritual humiliation because refusing would have raised suspicion, and in Hitler's world, suspicion alone could prove fatal. The bodyguards themselves became walking databases of human recognition. They memorized the faces of 8,000 regular staff members who worked in Hitler's various residences and headquarters secretaries. Cooks, groundskeepers, drivers, adjutants, clerks, 8,000 faces committed to memory so thoroughly that the bodyguards could identify individuals from partial views, recognize them from behind by posture and gait, spot strangers instantly in crowds where everyone should be familiar. Training for this memorization was intensive and ongoing. Bodyguards spent hours studying photographs, practicing recognition drills, where images flashed on screens for seconds, and they had to identify whether the person was authorized. They learned to read body language, to detect nervousness that might indicate hostile intent, to spot the micro-expressions that betray deception. Modern psychologists reviewing these training methods recognize techniques now used by intelligence agencies worldwide. The bodyguards were developing skills that wouldn't be formally studied until decades later. But they also studied history, because Rattenhuber believed understanding past assassination methods was essential to preventing future attempts. The bodyguards learned about the stabbing of Julius Caesar, how conspirators surrounded him so that even his loyal supporters couldn't intervene, how multiple strikes ensured success where a single assassin might have failed. They analyzed the shooting of Abraham Lincoln, how John Wilkes Booth studied the theater layout, timed his approach to a moment when laughter would mask the gunshot, planned his escape route with an actor's understanding of stage geography. They examined the bombing that killed Tsar Alexander II in 1881, how the assassins used a coordinated attack with multiple bomb throwers, how the Tsar survived the first explosion only to die in the second when he stepped from his damaged carriage to check on casualties. This particular case study haunted the bodyguards. It demonstrated that survival of an initial attack created vulnerability during the aftermath, when relief and chaos combined to lower defenses. Every bodyguard carried 2 items at all times, even when off-duty, even when asleep. The first was a Walther P38 pistol, 9mm, 8-round magazine, a weapon chosen for reliability and stopping power. They trained with these pistols until drawing and firing became muscle memory, until they could engage targets in darkness or while moving, until the weapon became an extension of their bodies. The second item was smaller, more terrible in its implications. A cyanide capsule, concealed in a false tooth or carried in a specially designed ring, represented the final security measure. If captured, bodyguards understood that enemies would torture them for information about Hitler's routines, his location, his security vulnerabilities. The cyanide offered an escape not just from pain, but from the possibility of betraying the man they protected. Swallow the capsule, bite down, and within seconds your heart stops, your breathing ceases, and the secrets die with you. Imagine carrying that choice in your mouth or on your finger, the option to end your life always present, always accessible. Some bodyguards reported becoming hyper-aware of the capsule's presence, touching their false tooth with their tongue compulsively, spinning the ring on their finger during moments of stress. Others forced themselves to forget it, training their minds to ignore the capsule's existence except in the theoretical circumstances when they might need it. But whether acknowledged or suppressed, the cyanide represented a commitment more absolute than any oath proof that these men had agreed not just to kill for Hitler, but to die, rather than risk his safety through their capture. By 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, and threats multiplied like bacteria in a wound, the protection system consumed resources that exceeding the requirements of entire army divisions. Hundreds of personnel, massive fuel allocations for the multiple trains and convoy vehicles, communication equipment, weapons, the underground bunkers expanding beneath every Hitler residence, all of this diverted from the war effort to protect one increasingly isolated man. Wehrmacht generals complained privately about the disproportion, noting that soldiers at the front lacked basic supplies, while bodyguards received the finest equipment and rations. But complaining remained private because questioning the Führer's security arrangements was itself suspicious, potentially treasonous. The system had become self-justifying. Each threat prevented proving the necessity of the apparatus. Each resource allocated justified by the irreplaceable nature of the man protected. Yet for all the bulletproof glass, all the memorized faces, all the tunnels and food tasters and cyanide capsules, the protection system couldn't defend against the rot spreading from within. Hitler's decline, physical, mental, moral, accelerated through 1944 and into 1945. The bodyguards watched him age decades in months, his left hand developing a tremor from Parkinson's disease that medication could no longer control, his rages becoming more frequent and less connected to external events, his detachment from reality growing until strategic briefings became exercises in fantasy. They saw Dr. Theodore Morell arrive multiple times daily with his black bag full of syringes, injecting Hitler with compounds whose ingredients Morell guarded like alchemical secrets. The bodyguards learned later, much later, After the war, after imprisonment, after decades of silence broke that Hitler received up to 5 injections daily by 1945. Methamphetamine for energy, testosterone for vitality, opiates for pain, even extracts from bull testicles, based on Morell's bizarre theory that animal vigor could be transferred to humans through chemistry. These injections kept Hitler functioning, but at a cost the bodyguards could observe even if they couldn't name it. Their Führer became a ghost animated by drugs, his natural rhythms destroyed, his sleep patterns erratic, his emotional regulation compromised by chemical tides that flowed through his bloodstream on schedules determined by a doctor whose qualifications were questionable and whose motivations were never entirely clear. Heinz Linger, who served as Hitler's personal valet and stood closer to him than almost anyone, later confessed to watching the injections with growing horror. He described Hitler's relief as the drugs hit his system, the visible relaxation of muscles that had been clenched with tension, the easing of the tremor that made eating and writing difficult. But Linge also saw the dependence, recognized addiction even if he knows, lacked formal vocabulary for it. Hitler needed the injections not to function well, but to function at all. Without Morell's ministrations, the Führer would have collapsed under the weight of his own biochemistry, his body in rebellion against the demands his will placed upon it. The bodyguards could protect Hitler from external threats, from bombs and bullets and poison in his food, but they were powerless against the enemy within the deterioration of the man himself, the unraveling of both body and mind that no security protocol could prevent. They watched it happen in slow motion, day by day, injection by injection, like witnesses to a car crash that takes years instead of seconds to complete. And still they remained at their posts. Still they memorized faces and checked escape routes and carried their pistols and cyanide. Still they maintained the fiction that their vigilance mattered, that keeping Hitler alive served some purpose beyond postponing the inevitable. The machinery of protection ground forward because stopping would require acknowledging that the man they protected was already gone, replaced by a chemical phantom whose decisions would drag Germany into an abyss, from which recovery would take generations. As 1944 became 1945, as Soviet forces pushed from the east and Allied armies pressed from the west, as German cities burned under bombing campaigns that turned night into day, the bodyguards prepared for the final act. They didn't know its precise form, whether it would be a bullet, a bomb, or simply the collapse of everything they had dedicated their lives to maintaining. But they felt it coming the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground begins to shake. The wolf's lair, that fortress of paranoia carved from forests and fear, would soon be abandoned, its tunnels left to fill with groundwater, its secrets buried under tons of explosive charges that would reduce it to twisted metal and broken concrete. The bodyguards would follow Hitler to Berlin, to a bunker even deeper and more confining than any they had previously inhabited, to a tomb that would become his monument and their prison. Tomorrow, we descend into witnessing into the impossible task of seeing atrocity and remaining silent, of knowing evil and serving it nonetheless. The bodyguard's greatest test was not protecting Hitler's life, but living with what that protection enabled. How does a human being function while watching horror unfold? How do ordinary men become accessories to genocide? The answers wait in the next chapter, and they offer no comfort. Heinrich Hoffmann's camera captured thousands of images during the Third Reich official portraits, propaganda photographs. Carefully composed scenes meant to project power and control. But if you look carefully at these photographs, if you examine the backgrounds rather than the foreground subjects, you see them, the bodyguards, standing casually against walls, positioned near doorways, ever-present shadows attending their Führer while he pointed at maps that marked the locations of extermination camps, ghettos, and mass graves. Before we go further into this darkness, I want to acknowledge what we're about to explore together. This chapter examines how ordinary men witnessed extraordinary evil. If you need to pause, pause. If you need to stop, stop. But if you can bear witness to what they witnessed, you might understand how atrocity becomes possible and what we must guard against in ourselves. Tomorrow, we'll follow these men into the bunker's final days. Tell someone about what you're learning here. They were there, not as participants in the killing, not as executioners pulling triggers or operating gas chamber controls, but as witnesses whose silence enabled the machine to continue functioning. This distinction matters legally but collapses morally under the weight of what they saw and chose not to speak about, what they heard and decided not to reveal, what they knew and elected to serve anyway. Rokas Misch sat at his switchboard in the Reich Chancellery, headphones pressed against his ears, connecting calls that directed the machinery of genocide with the same professional efficiency he applied to social calls and military briefings. The telephone, that mundane technology we use without thought, became in his hands an instrument through which horror flowed like electricity through copper wire. He was there when Heinrich Himmler called with progress reports on deportations. Misch would later describe decades later, when age and approaching death loosened the grip of self-preservation, hearing the SS chief announce that another 100,000 have been processed, with the casual tone of a factory manager discussing production, quotas, processed. The word itself was dehumanization encoded into language, transforming murder into an industrial operation complete with throughput calculations and efficiency metrics. Imagine sitting at that switchboard, hearing these updates multiple times per week, knowing that processed meant families separated on arrival platforms, children ripped from mothers' arms, human beings sorted into columns marked work and immediate death. Misch connected these calls. He logged them in official records. He maintained the communication system that allowed coordination of genocide across thousands of kilometers and millions of victims. When asked after the war how he functioned while hearing such things, Misch initially claimed he didn't understand what the words meant, that processed could have referred to any administrative action. But in his final interviews, done when he was past 90 years old and death waited like a patient appointment, he admitted a different truth. He knew, perhaps not the full scale no one person could comprehend 6 million murders, a number so vast it defeats human understanding. But he knew enough, and he answered the next call, connected the next wire, maintained the system that made coordination possible. Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, flew his Führer over the ruins of Warsaw in September 1939, circling low enough to observe the destruction German forces had inflicted during the siege. Bauer would confess decades later, lying in a Munich hospital with failing organs, about watching Hitler's face during that flight. The Führer pressed close to the window, looking down at the burning ghetto, at streets where bodies lay unburied, at a city being systematically erased. And he smiled. Bauer flew Hitler thousands of times, knew his moods the way a spouse knows a partner's emotional weather. He recognized the difference between the public smile Hitler deployed for cameras and the genuine expression that emerged in private moments. The smile over Warsaw was real pleasure drawn from devastation, satisfaction in destruction. Bauer described feeling his stomach turn, wanting to bank the aircraft away, to spare himself the sight of his passengers' joy in suffering. But he kept circling. He maintained the altitude Hitler requested. He flew exactly the route that provided the best views of the burning city. His hands on the controls were steady even as something inside him recoiled. Because this is what bodyguards do. They prioritize their principals' desires above their own moral discomfort. They compartmentalize. They perform their duties while trying to maintain walls between action and implication, between what they do and what it means. In 1942, Bauer flew Hitler to the east, where the industrialized murder of European Jews had reached full operational capacity. The flight path took them over Auschwitz, whether by design or circumstance. Bauer's confession wasn't entirely clear, memory and self-protection blurring details even in deathbed revelation. Hitler ordered a detour, wanting to observe the solution in progress from the Prond air. They descended to observation altitude, low enough to see the complex spread below them. The barracks arranged in precise rows, the rail lines where cattle cars arrived with human cargo, the selection ramps where SS doctors made their quick evaluations left to work, right to immediate death. The smoke rising from crematoria that operated 24 hours daily, consuming bodies faster than could be imagined but not faster than they arrived. Bauer circled for 20 minutes. He watched Hitler watch Auschwitz, observed him with what Bauer described as the attention a tourist gives to a monument. There was distance in Hitler's observation, a detachment that troubled Bauer more than anger or sadness would have. If Hitler had showed rage, that would have been comprehensible, even if directed toward evil ends. If he had displayed sorrow, however false, that would have been recognizable human emotion. But this clinical observation, this tourist's curiosity about an operation he had ordered, suggested something more disturbing, a complete separation between the human beings being murdered and Hitler's recognition of them as human. He watched it like a tourist viewing a monument, Bauer whispered to the journalist recording his confession in 2005. The metaphor is perfect and terrible. Tourists look at monuments with aesthetic appreciation, historical interest, perhaps national pride. They don't think about the human labor that built the structures, the lives spent in construction, the individual stories that accumulated into the monument's existence. Monuments are finished objects, separated from the process of their creation. Hitler viewed Auschwitz the same way, a completed work rather than an ongoing atrocity, an achievement rather than a crime. The bodyguards attended dinner parties in the Reich Chancellery where genocide was discussed between courses. Picture this: a formal dining room, crystal chandeliers throwing prismatic light across white tablecloths, fine china and silver cutlery, wine poured by staff who moved silently between chairs. Hitler sat at the head of the table, using specially designed silverware. His vegetarian meals required particular knives and forks, implements created specifically for him because he believed standard cutlery carried the contamination of meat. The conversation flowed around the table: military strategy and diplomatic maneuvering, economic policy and infrastructure plans. And then, as natural as discussing the weather, someone, perhaps Himmler, perhaps Heydrich before his assassination, perhaps Goebbels, would mention the progress of extermination operations. How many trains had run that week? Which populations had been targeted? What efficiencies had been achieved in the killing process? Hitler would respond while cutting his vegetables, discussing mass murder with the same tone he applied to autobahn construction or agricultural production. The bodyguards stood along walls, present but invisible in the way servants become invisible to those they serve. They heard every word. They watched Hitler nod approvingly when told that new methods had increased throughput at a particular camp. They observed the dinner guests, educated men, many of them, some with university degrees, cultured individuals who could discuss philosophy and art, treating genocide as an acceptable topic for mealtime conversation. Heinz Linge, Hitler's personal valet, stood closer to power than almost anyone except Eva Braun. His duties placed him in private spaces, present during moments when the public mask came off and the person beneath emerged. Linge was there when Hitler received films of executions footage shot by SS cameramen who documented killings for reasons that remain chillingly unclear. Were these films training materials, records for posterity, evidence of loyalty through atrocity? The question of why such films existed is almost as disturbing as their content. Linge described watching Hitler watch these executions. The Führer would sit in a darkened screening room, attention focused on the screen with what Linge characterized as the attention of a theatre critic. He would comment on the efficiency of the execution methods, discuss whether the condemned showed courage or fear, analyze the performance as if reviewing actors in a play rather than witnessing real deaths of real people whose lives ended while cameras rolled. This detail, perhaps more than any other, reveals the depth of Hitler's disconnection from empathy. To watch filmed executions with critical analysis, to treat death as performance worthy of review, requires the complete absence of recognition that the dying were human beings whose interior lives were as rich and complex as the viewer's own. Hitler had achieved what psychologists call solipsism, the inability to recognize other minds as fully real. Everyone else became extras in his personal narrative, their value measured solely by utility or threat to his purposes. The bodyguards knew about Dr. Sigmund Rascher's high-altitude experiments at Dachau. Rascher, an SS physician, placed concentration camp prisoners in pressure chambers, simulating conditions at extreme altitudes. then documented what happened as they died from oxygen deprivation, pulmonary barotrauma, and decompression sickness. The experiments had theoretical military application, understanding how pilots might survive if their aircraft lost pressurization at high altitude, but the methods were torture disguised as research. Hitler discussed these experiments during afternoon tea, not in hushed tones suggesting shame or secrecy, but openly, as one might discuss interesting scientific developments. He asked questions about the results, about what the data revealed regarding human physiological limits. The bodyguards served the tea, arranged the cakes, stood present while their Führer treated torture as research as acceptable. Dinner conversation. They saw the architectural models Albert Speer presented in the Reich Chancellery's marble halls, plans for expanded concentration camps, detailed miniatures showing where new barracks would be built, where crematorium capacity would be increased, how rail lines would be extended to accommodate higher volumes of arrivals. These weren't military installations or prisoner of war camps. The language surrounding their construction made their purpose explicit. They were extermination facilities, designed from the beginning for industrial-scale murder. The bodyguards helped arrange these models on display tables, adjusted lighting so details were visible, stood guard while Hitler and his architects discussed the plans. They heard conversations about processing capacity and disposal efficiency, language that transformed murder into logistics, atrocity into engineering, challenges to be solved through better design. Some bodyguards accompanied Hitler to military hospitals where wounded soldiers recuperated from injuries that had cost them limbs, sight, or facial features. These visits were supposedly for morale, the Führer showing care for his fighting men. But Hitler refused to visit wards containing amputees or the severely disfigured. He would walk through sections where injuries were less visible, shake hands with men who appeared relatively whole, then leave before entering areas where damage was catastrophic. The bodyguards heard him declare these damaged soldiers useless to the Reich. Not quietly, not as an embarrassed aside, but as a stated position that aligned with his eugenics ideology. Men too broken to work or fight were drains on resources, mouths to feed without producing value in return. His social Darwinism permitted no space for compassion toward the weak or wounded. Survival of the fittest wasn't just evolutionary theory but moral framework. Permission to discard those who failed to meet arbitrary standards of usefulness. They witnessed his rage when informed that Jewish scientists had fled Germany in the years before war made escape impossible. Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Lise Meitner, and hundreds of others whose brilliance might have advanced German science instead contributed to Allied research, including the atomic bomb development that Hitler feared might be used against Germany. But his rage wasn't moral opposition to persecution. It was anger at lost resources, frustration that valuable assets had escaped before they could be exploited or eliminated according to his preference. The bodyguards heard him curse the scientists as traitors for fleeing rather than remaining to be murdered. The logical gymnastics required to hold this position that Jews should be killed but also that they were traitors for escaping killing revealed the incoherence at fascism's core. It wasn't a rational system, but an emotional one, driven by hatred that twisted logic into whatever shape justified. The predetermined conclusion. Living with this knowledge, while maintaining function, required psychological mechanisms that human beings employ when reality becomes unbearable. The bodyguards couldn't openly oppose Hitler that meant execution, likely preceded by torture, certainly followed by reprisals against their families. They couldn't flee. Where would they go? How would they survive? Who would protect their loved ones from retribution? They couldn't even speak truthfully to each other, because trust was impossible in a system where denunciation provided currency and betrayal carried rewards. So they adapted. They developed what psychologists now call doubling, the creation of a second self, capable of functioning in moral darkness, while preserving a primary self that maintained some sense of normalcy and humanity. The bodyguard on duty, the one who heard genocide discussed over tea and stood silent, existed separately from the man who went home to his family, played with his children, made love to his wife. These two selves occupied the same body but maintained psychological separation, each pretending the other didn't exist. This doubling allowed them to compartmentalize experience in ways that protected sanity at the cost of integrity. The work self-accepted atrocity as normal, used euphemistic language that obscured horror, followed orders without examining implications. The home self focused on private concerns, on family dinners and children's homework, and the small domestic rituals that construct meaning in ordinary life. The wall between these selves had to remain strong, because if it crumbled, if the knowledge carried by the work self fully penetrated the home self, the resulting cognitive dissonance would be crushing. But walls, even psychological ones, are never perfect. Knowledge bleeds through, carries over, contaminates. Some bodyguards developed insomnia, lying awake at 3 a.m, while their minds replayed conversations they had witnessed, images they had seen, implications they had tried to avoid. Others drank heavily, using alcohol to blur the edges of memory, to create chemical distance from reality. Several developed physical symptoms: chronic stomach pain, tension headaches, skin conditions that appeared without medical explanation and resisted treatment. Karl Tenezek attempted suicide in 1943. He left a note that contained only one sentence: "I cannot unsee what I have seen." His suicide attempt failed. A fellow bodyguard found him before he bled out from slashed wrists, but the system's response revealed its priorities. Instead of being offered psychological care or relieved from duty, Tenezek was threatened with execution for cowardice and forced to return to service. His weakness had to be contained, not because anyone cared about his well-being, but because his breakdown threatened to crack the collective denial that allowed all the other bodyguards to continue functioning. Most adapted without visible breakdown, normalizing the abnormal through daily exposure. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of their experience, not that they eventually crumbled under moral weight, but that they didn't. They continued eating their meals, sleeping in their beds, performing their duties, year after year, while witnessing and enabling atrocity that should have shattered any remaining capacity for normal human function. They told themselves they were protecting the office rather than the man, serving Germany rather than Hitler personally. They focused on technical aspects of their duties, the precision of their weapons maintenance, the efficiency of their security protocols, the skill required to identify threats rather than the larger implications of their service. They convinced themselves that they were simple soldiers following orders, that responsibility lay with those who gave commands rather than those who enabled command givers to survive. These are the same rationalizations humans have employed throughout history when participating in atrocity. "I was just following orders" has become almost a cliché, repeated so often it's lost impact. But standing behind the cliché are real psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. The bodyguards weren't exceptions or monsters. They were examples of human moral flexibility when subjected to specific pressures and provided certain justifications. Yet, in their quiet moments, when the defences weakened and the walls between selves thinned, they carried weight that pressed down like physical mass. They saw things that could never be unseen, heard things that would echo forever, knew things that contaminated everything they touched afterward. This knowledge became part of them, encoded into memory, written into neurons, carried forward into every subsequent moment of their lives. Some tried to confess, carefully and obliquely, testing whether anyone would listen. Wives reported husbands mumbling in their sleep about smoke and ash, about children crying, about fires that burned with terrible purpose. But full confession was impossible during the Reich's existence. Admitting knowledge meant admitting complicity, and complicity meant death. So they remained silent. They stood at their posts. They maintained the security that allowed Hitler to survive assassination attempts and continue directing the machinery of genocide. They were witnesses who couldn't close their eyes, guards who protected the architect of their own moral destruction. As 1945 approached and defeat became undeniable, the bodyguards began to understand that their silence would soon face a reckoning. Allied forces advancing from both east and west would eventually capture them. There would be trials, questions, investigations into who knew what and when. The weight they had carried in silence would demand accounting. But first, There were 13 days to endure in a concrete tomb beneath Berlin, watching the final collapse of everything they had served, witnessing the end of the man they had protected from external threats but could not save from himself. Tomorrow, we descend into that tomb. We walk beside these men through the Reich's final hours, when the machinery of paranoia and protection ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The bodyguards had witnessed Hitler at his most human and his most monstrous. In the bunker's final days, those two aspects would merge completely, and the witnesses would discover that some things, once seen, destroy the seer as surely as the seen. The darkness deepens from here, but we must follow these men to the end, because understanding requires walking the full path, however terrible it becomes. Before we enter this tomb together, take a breath. What follows is history at its most claustrophobic. 13 days in underground rooms where the Third Reich died while its creators watched. If this journey feels overwhelming, remember why we take it. Understanding how evil ends is as important as understanding how it begins. Tomorrow, we'll emerge from the bunker and follow these men into the scattered aftermath. Share this if you believe others need to witness what we're witnessing. The Führer bunker wasn't built for comfort. It was a concrete grave constructed before its occupant died, 18 rooms on 2 levels, accessed through heavy steel doors that sealed with mechanical certainty. The air system, designed by engineers who built submarines, recycled the same oxygen again and again, filtering but never quite refreshing, creating an atmosphere that tasted of human breath and fear mixed in equal measures. Rokas Mish, operating the communications equipment, described the air as breathing death itself. Not metaphorically literally, the recycled atmosphere carried weight, thickness, a quality that made lungs work. Harder to extract oxygen from air that had already passed through too many pairs of lungs. Every breath was someone else's exhale, every inhalation contaminated by the exhalations of those dying by degrees in this underground tomb. The bunker's lighting came from naked bulbs that burned constantly, eliminating the natural rhythm of day and night, destroying the circadian cycles that anchor human psychology to the turning of Earth. Time became abstract, measured not by sunrise and sunset, but by Soviet artillery barrages that shook dust from concrete ceilings with metronomic regularity. The bodyguards, trained to maintain alertness across irregular schedules, found even their conditioning tested by the sensory deprivation of underground existence. On that 56th birthday, Hitler emerged from his private quarters to greet a delegation that represented the final absurdity of the Reich's collapse. 12-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth, children pulled from homes and classrooms, to defend Berlin with weapons that exceeded their body weight, stood at attention in the Chancellery garden while their Führer pinned iron crosses to their chests. The bodyguards watched through armoured windows as a man who had sent millions to their deaths congratulated children for their readiness to die in his service. Heinz Ling stood beside Hitler during this ceremony, close enough to smell the medication that seeped from his pores. Dr. Morell's injections created an odour that Ling described as chemical sweat, the scent of a body processing substances it was never designed to handle. Hitler's left hand trembled continuously now, the Parkinson's disease advancing beyond any pretense of control. When he pinned medals to the boys' uniforms, his fingers fumbled with the clasps, requiring multiple attempts to secure pins that should have taken seconds. The boys stared at their Führer with expressions. The bodyguards recognized the dissonance between propaganda image and physical reality. They had been raised on posters and films showing Hitler as a vigorous leader, a man of destiny and power. Instead, they met a trembling figure who aged before their eyes, whose skin had taken on the grey pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks, whose voice cracked with exhaustion even while delivering the patriotic platitudes expected of him. After the ceremony, Hitler retreated underground, and the boys were sent to defensive positions where most of them would die within days, their bodies adding to the hundreds of thousands that would litter Berlin's streets before fighting ceased. The bodyguards never learned their names. They became another statistical addition to the millions of deaths Hitler's leadership had caused, memorable only as symbols of a system that consumed its own children. Inside the bunker, The psychological pressure increased in direct proportion to the tightening noose of Soviet advance. Maps covered the walls of the conference room where daily briefings occurred, colored pins marking unit positions, arrows indicating movements, shaded areas showing territory lost. Each day, the pins moved closer to the center. The arrows pointed more directly at Berlin. The shaded areas expanded until they surrounded the city completely. Geography itself became a countdown timer, space and time collapsing together as the front lines approached the bunker. Military officers arrived for briefings with expressions that revealed the futility of their discussions before words were spoken. General Hans Krebs, the final chief of the General Staff, delivered reports about non-existent divisions, phantom reinforcements that existed only in Hitler's desperate imagination. The bodyguards heard Hitler issue orders to armies that had been destroyed weeks earlier, watched him move pins on maps representing units that had ceased to exist, listened to him plan counter-offensives that required resources Germany no longer possessed. Delusion took physical form in these briefings. Hitler would point to the map, his trembling finger tracing a route for an army group that had surrendered or been annihilated days before. Officers would exchange glances but remain silent, because contradicting the Führer meant being accused of defeatism, and defeatism meant execution. So they nodded, took notes, saluted, and left to not implement orders that couldn't be implemented, to not command troops that no longer existed, to not achieve objectives that had become impossible. The bodyguards witnessed this theatre of delusion multiple times daily. They understood, even if Hitler didn't, even if he couldn't, that the war was over, that defeat was absolute, that the only remaining questions were how many more would die before official surrender, and what would happen to those trapped in the bunker when Soviet forces finally arrived. Yet they maintained their security protocols, continued their rotating watches, kept their weapons clean, and loaded, protected a man who needed protection only from reality itself. On April 28th, a BBC broadcast penetrated the bunker's communication systems. Rochus Misch, monitoring the channels, picked up the transmission and heard news that shattered the few remaining illusions of loyalty in Hitler's inner circle. Heinrich Himmler, the SS Reichsführer, Hitler's loyal Heinrich, who had administered the genocide with bureaucratic efficiency, had attempted to negotiate Germany's surrender to the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. Misch brought the news to Hitler, who listened with an expression Misch described as a man watching his own death. Then the rage came. Not the calculated anger Hitler deployed for political effect, but something primal and uncontrolled, a fury so intense it seemed his body might tear itself apart from the force of emotion flowing through it. He screamed for 3 hours straight, his voice carrying through the bunker's ventilation shafts, echoing in rooms where staff covered their ears against the sound, filling the underground spaces with raw vocalization of betrayal. The bodyguards had heard Hitler rage before his temper was legendary, his ability to work himself into volcanic fury over minor provocations well established. But this was different. This rage came from the recognition that loyalty, the quality he had demanded absolutely and received from so many for so long, had its limits. Even Himmler, even faithful Heinrich, who had supervised the murder of millions, had decided that personal survival mattered more than loyalty to the Führer. If Himmler could betray him, anyone could. If Himmler could attempt to save himself through surrender, loyalty itself was revealed as transactional, conditional, a bargain rather than a bond. The bodyguards felt the implications cascade through the bunker like an emotional shockwave. They too were calculating survival probabilities, considering whether their oaths remained, binding when the man to whom they swore was clearly dying, whether loyalty to a lost cause was noble or simply stupid. But unlike Himmler, they had no channels to Western allies, no Swedish intermediaries, no diplomatic options. They were trapped in the bunker as surely as Hitler, their fates bound to his not through choice but through circumstance, and the Soviet forces that surrounded them on all sides. That night, April 28th into 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun. The ceremony occurred in the map room where military briefings had charted the Reich's collapse. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann served as witnesses, standing in their uniforms. while a municipal official located somehow in the chaos of Berlin's final days and brought to the bunker performed a civil ceremony stripped of sentiment or celebration. Eva wore a black dress. Hitler wore his standard uniform. The vows were exchanged in minutes, the paperwork signed on a table still covered with military maps. Soviet shells exploded overhead with perfect timing, each impact shaking dust from the ceiling onto the marriage certificate, a literal covering of their union with the debris of the collapsing Reich. The bodyguards stood at attention during the ceremony, bearing witness to this final legal formalization of a relationship that had existed in shadow for years. Eva Braun had been Hitler's companion since the early 30s, kept hidden from public view because the propaganda image required the Führer to appear married to Germany alone, devoted to his nation without the distraction of personal romance. Now, with less than 48 hours remaining in their lives, secrecy no longer mattered. They could marry because nothing they did now would affect anything beyond these concrete walls. After the ceremony, a small celebration occurred, champagne from bottles that had been stored for years, waiting for victory that never came, now opened to mark a wedding that celebrated nothing except the end of pretense. The bodyguards saw Eva smile, saw her lean against Hitler with genuine affection despite everything, despite knowing death waited measured in hours rather than days. Her loyalty, at least, remained absolute. She had chosen to die beside him when she could have escaped, could have lived out her life in Bavaria, could have survived to become a footnote rather than a final chapter. Hans Bauer offered one last time to fly Hitler out. He claimed he could land a Fieseler Storch, a small aircraft capable of extremely short takeoffs and landings on the east-west axis boulevard that ran near the Reich Chancellery. It would require timing the approach between artillery barrages, avoiding the Soviet fighters that prowled Berlin's skies, threading through flak and chaos to reach a destination that Bauer couldn't clearly name because nowhere remained safe. But technically, theoretically, it might be possible. Hitler refused without lengthy consideration. He was done fleeing. The man who had lived in paranoia for 12 years, who had designed his entire existence around survival at any cost, who had built tunnels and employed food tasters and carried security to the point of absurdity, now embraced death with what appeared to be relief. He told Bauer that his body would not be displayed in Moscow, that he would not provide the spectacle of a captured dictator paraded before his enemies. He would die on his own terms, in his chosen location, by his own hand. The bodyguards recognized something in Hitler's resolve that they hadn't seen before, a kind of peace that comes with accepting the inevitable. For 12 years he had fought against the possibility of defeat with every resource Germany possessed, and millions of lives he spent without accounting. Now, with defeat absolute and undeniable, he could stop fighting. The relief visible in his demeanor was almost obscene relief, derived from surrendering to death that would also end the suffering of millions who still lived but could have been spared if he had accepted reality earlier. On April 29th, Hitler tested the cyanide capsules. He had received them from Himmler months earlier, before the betrayal, when the Reichsführer SS still provided security services that included suicide assistance. But Hitler didn't trust that Himmler's betrayal might not have extended to providing fake capsules, hoping to capture the Führer alive. So he tested them on Blondie, his beloved German shepherd who had been his companion for years. The bodyguards watched this test with a horror that penetrated even their carefully constructed emotional armor. A veterinarian was present, Werner Hase, who had once treated human patients but now served as Hitler's medical attendant in the absence of Dr. Morell, who had fled days earlier. Hase forced Blondie's jaws open, crushed a capsule, and released the cyanide into the dog's mouth. Blondie's death was neither quick nor peaceful, despite assurances that cyanide worked instantly. The dog convulsed, her legs spasming, her body twisting with neural signals that fired randomly as poison destroyed cellular respiration. Foam appeared at her mouth. Her eyes showed confusion and pain, and what looked terribly like betrayal. Why was her master allowing this to happen? Why couldn't he protect her? Why did safety vanish and agony replace it? It took nearly a minute for Blondie to die, though later accounts would claim seconds because witnesses wanted to remember it as merciful. Hitler watched with clinical attention, confirming the capsules worked as intended, proving that his final escape route remained viable. Then he ordered Blondie's body removed, dismissed everyone from the room, and was seen by Linger to be crying, whether from grief over his dog's death or from the weight of what that death foreshadowed. No one could say with certainty. The final meal happened on April 30th, afternoon sliding toward evening, though time had lost meaning in the bunkerless space. Spaghetti with light tomato sauce, a vegetarian meal prepared by Hitler's personal cook, who had somehow maintained standards even as Berlin burned overhead. Hitler ate little, pushing food around his plate while others at the table, Eva, Goebbels and his wife Magda, Bormann, and a few others maintained conversation that skirted the enormous silence waiting to fill the room. After the meal, Hitler and Eva retreated to his private quarters. They shook hands with those assembled in the corridor, a formal farewell that acknowledged what everyone knew was coming. Hitler's hand trembled as it gripped theirs. Linge, Bormann, Goebbels, the bodyguards who had protected him for years. Eva's hand was steady. She had chosen this, walked into it with eyes open, and whatever else can be said about her, she faced death without visible fear. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. The sound, in that enclosed concrete space, was impossibly loud, a percussion that stopped conversations and froze everyone in position. The bodyguards knew what it meant. They had been preparing for this moment, dreading it and simultaneously wishing it would arrive so the waiting could end. Heinz Linge waited several minutes before entering Hitler's study, though whether from respect, fear, or simply the human reluctance to confirm what you know to be true, he never adequately explained. When he finally opened the door, he found Hitler slumped on a sofa, his head tilted right where the bullet had entered his temple, blood pooling on the cushions beneath him and dripping with terrible patience onto the floor. Eva sat beside him, dead from cyanide. Her lips had already turned the distinctive blue that indicates hydrogen cyanide poisoning, her body positioned carefully, her dress arranged with a modesty that suggested she had considered how she would be found. She had bitten the capsule and died almost instantly, dropping seconds before or after Hitler pulled the trigger, timing that would be debated by historians but didn't matter to anyone present. Linge stood in the doorway, looking at the scene, and later described feeling nothing. Not grief, not relief, not triumph or sadness or any emotion he could name, just a vast emptiness, the absence of feeling that occurs when reality exceeds the mind's capacity to process it. The man he had served for years was dead by his own hand. The woman who had shown kindness to staff was dead beside him. The Reich was over. And Linge felt nothing at all. The bodyguards carried the bodies upstairs, wrapped in blankets, so that staff wouldn't have to see the death visible in Hitler's ruined face or Eva's blue lips. They climbed the stairs from bunker to garden, emerging into daylight for the first time in days, the smoke from burning Berlin stinging their eyes, Soviet shells still falling with random malevolence that could kill them even as they performed this final duty. In the garden, in a shallow crater created by earlier bombardment, they placed the bodies side by side. Someone accounts differ on who poured 200 litres of gasoline over the corpses, fuel that had been stored for this purpose, jerry cans filled and positioned days earlier when Hitler issued instructions for his body's disposal. The gasoline, soaked into clothing and blankets, pooled around the bodies, created fumes that made the bodyguards dizzy even before ignition. They stepped back. Someone lit a rag, threw it onto the gasoline-soaked bodies, and fire erupted with a sound like fabric tearing. The flames were intense, fed by gasoline and the combustible materials in clothing, hot enough that the bodyguards had to retreat further, shielding their faces from heat that felt like physical pressure against their skin. They stood in the garden, watching the bodies burn, while Soviet shells continued falling around them. Smoke from the burning corpses mixed with the smoke from burning Berlin, becoming indistinguishable, two forms of destruction combining into a single rising column that carried ash and heat toward a sky that had forgotten what blue looked like. Rochus Misch watched from a bunker window, unwilling to go outside but unable to look away. He described the smoke as thick and black and endless, rising like a pillar that marked the exact center of Germany's collapsed empire. The symbolism was almost too perfect, the Reich burning down to its architect, everything reducing to smoke and ash and the smell of gasoline combustion mixed with human remains. The burning took hours. Bodies resist fire, require sustained heat to creep completely. The bodyguards took turns maintaining the fire, adding gasoline when flames diminished, using poles to position the bodies for better combustion, performing this grim work while artillery fell and bullets cracked through the air from street fighting that had reached blocks near the Reich Chancellery. When they finally finished, when nothing recognizable remained except bone fragments and ash, they scraped the remains into a shell crater and covered them with earth. No markers, no ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond the act itself. Hitler had demanded his body not be displayed or recovered by enemies. His bodyguards, in their final act of service, ensured that demand was met. Inside the bunker, life continued for a few more hours, a few more days for some, animated by momentum even though the purpose of animation had been removed. Goebbels and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda and Heide, aged 4 to 12, injecting them with morphine, then forcing cyanide capsules into their mouths while they were unconscious, killing them in their sleep, because the parents couldn't imagine a world where their children survived without the Reich. Then Goebbels and Magda went to the garden, where an SS orderly shot them both in the back of the head, their bodies burned like Hitler's though with less ceremony and less gasoline. The bodyguards prepared for their own escapes or captures. Some stripped off SS insignia, hoping to pass as Wehrmacht soldiers. Others accepted that capture was inevitable and prepared to face whatever came. Rokas Misch gathered his belongings, a few photographs, some personal items, and on May 2nd attempted escape through Berlin's subway tunnels. The tunnels had been deliberately flooded by retreating German forces trying to slow Soviet advance, the water contaminated with sewage and corpses, rising to waist height in some sections. Misch waded through this toxic soup, the water cold enough to shock and filthy enough to carry disease, pushing forward in darkness relieved only by occasional flashlights that revealed scenes of horror, bodies floating face down, wounded soldiers who had crawled into the tunnels to die, civilians who had sought shelter and found only another form of death. He emerged near Anhalter Bahnhof, one of Berlin's great railway stations now reduced to rubble, gasping for air that tasted of smoke and rot, his uniform soaked with contaminated water, his eyes burning from chemicals or infection or simply the strain of witnessing what he had witnessed. Soviet soldiers captured him within hours. He didn't resist. Resistance was pointless, and he was tired, a tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion into something spiritual. The fatigue of a man who had carried too much for too long and could finally set it down, even if setting it down meant captivity rather than freedom. The 13 days in the bunker had ended. The bodyguards had watched their principal die, burned his body, witnessed the final collapse of everything they had served. Now they faced the consequences of that service, the accounting that awaited in Soviet prison camps and Allied interrogation rooms, and the court of history that would judge them long after their deaths. But that accounting still lay ahead. Tomorrow, we follow these men as they scatter across the wreckage of Europe, some captured immediately, others escaping to live shadowed lives, all of them carrying memories that would poison everything they touched, for whatever time remained to them. The bunker is behind us now. The worst of the witnessing is complete. What remains is the longest trial of all the trial of living afterward, of waking each morning with the knowledge of what you witnessed and enabled, of carrying that weight through decades until death finally provides release. The bodyguards emerged from the bunker into a world that would never let them forget, that would demand their testimonies and confessions, and finally their deaths, before it considered the account settled. Their story of service had ended. Their story of consequence was only beginning. Rokas Misch emerged from Berlin's flooded subway tunnels on May 2, 1945, blinking in daylight that felt like an accusation. His uniform clung to his body, heavy with contaminated water that carried the chemical residue of a dying city. Soviet soldiers appeared within minutes. Their rifles trained on this bedraggled figure who wore the unmistakable insignia of the SS, who carried in his eyes the particular emptiness of someone who had witnessed the end of everything. Before we walk with these scattered men through their years of consequence, I want you to consider something. Punishment and justice are not always the same thing. What follows is the story of men facing both, and sometimes neither. Tomorrow, we'll hear the deathbed confessions that finally broke decades of silence. If this story has changed how you see history, share it with someone who needs that changed vision. They didn't shoot him, though they could have. Summary execution of SS officers was common enough in those chaotic days when Berlin still smoldered and Soviet soldiers operated under rage fueled by what they had discovered in concentration camps as they pushed west. But Misch was valuable, a communications officer who had been inside the Führer bunker, who knew things Soviet intelligence wanted to extract. So instead of a bullet, he received handcuffs and a shove toward a truck that would begin his journey into the Soviet Gulag system. The truck carried him east, away from Berlin's ruins, into territory that had been fought over so recently that bodies still littered the roadsides, evidence of the meat grinder that warfare had become. Other prisoners sat in the truck bed with him. Wehrmacht soldiers mostly, regular army rather than SS. Men who had the misfortune of being captured in the wrong place at the wrong time. They didn't speak to Misch once they noticed his insignia. Even in captivity, even among prisoners, the SS remained separate, contaminated by association with atrocities everyone had heard about, even if few had witnessed directly. Misch would spend 9 years in Soviet captivity, not in a single location but rotating through a series of labor camps where prisoners built roads, logged forests, worked mines under conditions that killed through exposure, malnutrition, and the simple mathematics of calories consumed versus energy expended. He learned to survive through strategies that would haunt him later, stealing food from weaker prisoners, volunteering for indoor work assignments that offered marginal protection from Siberian winters, maintaining enough strength to appear useful while conserving enough energy to endure. Soviet interrogators questioned him repeatedly about Hitler's final days. They wanted confirmation that the body they had discovered in the Reich Chancellery garden, charred beyond easy recognition, buried in a shell crater, was actually Hitler rather than a double or a substitute. They asked about Hitler's health, his habits, his routines, mining Misch's memory for details that might verify but identity when physical evidence proved ambiguous. Misch told them what they wanted to hear, not from any sense of honor or loyalty to Hitler's memory, but because cooperation bought better treatment, an extra ration, a day without beatings. He described Hitler's final hours in the bunker, the gunshot, the burning of the bodies. He drew maps of the bunker's layout, identified photographs of other SS officers who might still be free, provided intelligence that helped Soviet authorities track down fugitives who had escaped Berlin's fall. He learned to compartmentalize his role in the Reich from his identity as a prisoner. The man who had operated Hitler's switchboard, who had connected calls directing genocide, became separate from the prisoner who hauled logs in Siberian forests. This compartmentalization was survival. If he allowed the two identities to merge, if he accepted full moral weight of what he had enabled, the burden would be crushing. So he split himself, kept the past in one chamber of his mind and the present in another, and rarely allowed the wall between them to thin. Hans Bauer's capture happened differently but led to similar consequences. Hitler's personal pilot had remained in the bunker complex longer than Misch, attempting to coordinate evacuation of remaining staff before finally accepting that flight was impossible. When he tried to escape on May 2nd, Soviet soldiers captured him near the Weidendamme Bridge, one of the last crossing points in central Berlin still accessible. They beat him during the initial interrogation, not systematically, not as part of a designed torture protocol, but with the casual violence of angry men who had lost friends to German bullets and bombs, who had seen what German occupation had done to Soviet territories, who wanted physical satisfaction before formal questioning began. Bauer's leg was injured in the beating. The exact nature of the injury remained unclear, even in his later accounts, memory blurred. By pain and the chaos of capture, the injury became infected. In the unsanitary conditions of the temporary prison where Soviets held captured SS officers before transport east, infection spread with terrifying speed, gangrene set in, the tissue death visible in discoloration and smell, the characteristic odor of rotting flesh that no one who has encountered it can ever forget. Soviet medical staff, such as they were, lacked antibiotics. Penicillin existed but remained scarce, reserved for Soviet citizens rather than captured enemies. They amputated Bauer's right leg without anesthesia. He was held down by 4 soldiers, while a surgeon cut through muscle and bone with tools that hadn't been properly sterilized, then cauterized the stump with heated metal that burned flesh and sealed blood vessels through thermal destruction. Bauer screamed until his voice gave out, then continued screaming silently, his mouth open in a rictus of pain that observers described as disturbing even by the standards of what they had witnessed during the war. He survived the amputation, but woke to a new reality, a prisoner with a disability that made him vulnerable in a system where weakness was often fatal. But his knowledge of Hitler's compound layouts, his familiarity with Nazi leadership's private lives, his understanding of Luftwaffe capabilities and limitations, made him valuable enough to preserve. Soviet intelligence moved him to Lubyanka prison in Moscow, where he spent 10 years drawing detailed maps and diagrams in exchange for medical care that kept him alive, if not whole. The maps were extraordinary blueprints of the Berghof, showing every room, every tunnel, every defensive position. Diagrams of the Wolf's Lair with dimensions accurate to within centimeters. Floor plans of Hitler's various headquarters, annotated with security protocols, guard rotations, communication systems. Bauer drew from memory, reconstructing architecture he had moved through for years, his hand steady despite the phantom pain that radiated from his missing leg. He told himself he was simply providing historical documentation, that the war was over, and these maps no longer compromised security, because there was no security left to compromise. But he knew Soviet intelligence wanted the information for future reference, to understand how fortress systems were constructed, to study the architecture of paranoia for application in their own security designs. He was helping the enemy understand German methods. This knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, but survival meant setting down stones you couldn't carry, even when they represented your last claims to loyalty or honor. Heinz Linger vanished more completely into the Soviet system. As Hitler's personal valet, the man who had dressed him and undressed him, who had been present during private moments no one else witnessed, Linge possessed intimate knowledge the Soviets wanted extracted in detail. They sent him to camps beyond. The Urals, locations so remote that official records barely acknowledged their existence, where prisoners worked until they died, and were replaced by new prisoners in a cycle that continued regardless of political changes in Moscow. Linge built roads across permafrost, ground that remained frozen year-round, and required explosives to break through before construction could proceed. Winter temperatures reached -40 degrees Celsius, the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit converge, where exposed skin freezes in minutes and breathing feels like inhaling knives. Summer brought different miseries. Mosquitoes in clouds so thick they obscured vision, mud that swallowed equipment and sometimes men, heat that made water sources scarce and disease vectors thrive. He lost teeth to scurvy, weight to starvation rations, memories to the dissociation that protected sanity under unbearable conditions. Other prisoners reported that Linge rarely spoke, working in silence broken only by necessary communication, as if words had been used up, and he had none remaining. When he did speak, it was often in fragments, half-sentences that started nowhere and ended nowhere, linguistic debris that suggested a mind struggling to maintain coherence under sustained assault. Soviet authorities released him in 1955, 10 years after capture, as part of negotiations between the Soviet Union and West Germany that exchanged prisoners for political concessions. He returned to Germany as a ghost, weighing perhaps 40 kilograms less than when captured, his face a geography of deprivation, his eyes carrying distances that no one who hadn't experienced similar captivity could understand or bridge. Not all the bodyguards were captured. Some shed their SS uniforms in the chaos of Berlin's fall. burning or burying the insignia that marked them for immediate execution or harsh imprisonment, changing into Wehrmacht uniforms or civilian clothes that offered camouflage in the mass of displaced persons flooding across defeated Germany. Karl Wilhelm Krauss, who had served as Hitler's personal valet before Linge, managed this transformation successfully enough to avoid Soviet capture. He made his way to Hamburg through a journey that took months, moving at night, hiding during day, avoiding checkpoints and displaced persons camps, where Allied authorities checked identities and sorted prisoners according to their service records. Hamburg was rubble. Allied bombing had destroyed approximately half the city, killed over 37,000 civilians, left survivors living in basements and ruins. But rubble provided cover, allowed people to reinvent themselves, created confusion that could be exploited by those who needed new identities. Krauss became a hospital orderly, work that required no credentials and attracted minimal scrutiny because few people wanted jobs that involved cleaning bedpans and washing bodies. He kept his head down, spoke little of his past, constructed a fiction of having been a clerk in a supply depot, service too mundane to invite investigation. For decades, he maintained this fiction successfully, marrying a woman who knew him only as the quiet orderly who worked night shifts and had nightmares he wouldn't discuss. Historians tracked him down in the 1970s, following paper trails and cross-referencing testimonies until they arrived at a Hamburg apartment where an elderly man answered the door and knew immediately why they had come. He didn't deny his identity. Once confronted with evidence, there seemed to be relief in acknowledgement, the lifting of a weight he had carried in isolation for 30 years. He gave interviews that filled gaps in historical knowledge, but never expressed remorse that satisfied questioners. He had been a servant, he insisted, not a participant. He had followed orders, not given them. He was a witness, not an accomplice. These distinctions mattered legally. Krauss was never prosecuted, but morally they dissolved under scrutiny. Being present is participation. Following orders is choice. Witnessing without objection is enabling. Yet Krauss maintained his self-conception as tangential to evil rather than embedded within it, a position psychologically necessary for his continued function, but historically untenable for those examining his role. Others fled further, following ratlines escape routes organized by various networks including remnants of the SS, sympathetic clergy, and opportunistic smugglers who saw profit in moving wanted men beyond Allied reach. Hermann Göring's pilot, Kurt Scheidler, reached Argentina via Spain and Italy, traveling under false documentation that identified him as a mechanic from Bavaria with no military service beyond brief Wehrmacht conscription. Argentina, in the late 1940s and early 50s, became home to thousands of German refugees, some innocent victims of political upheaval, but others war criminals, seeking sanctuary in a country whose government showed minimal interest in distinguishing between the two groups. Scheidler settled in Buenos Aires, found work giving Spanish lessons to German immigrants who needed language skills for employment, and constructed a life that bore no visible relationship to his service in the Third Reich. He lived in Argentina for 40 years, until 1987, dying in a Buenos Aires hospital without facing prosecution or serious investigation, despite occasional rumors in German immigrant communities about his true identity. His nights, according to the woman who lived with him for 20 years, were haunted by dreams he described as flying through fire, visions where bombers he had piloted dropped their loads on cities that burned while he circled overhead, unable to land, unable to escape. The psychological wreckage manifested in patterns that psychologists would later recognize as characteristic of perpetrator trauma, different from victim trauma, but no less destructive of normal function. Approximately 80% of the bodyguards who survived the war, and whose later lives were documented, developed chronic alcoholism, using drink to blur memories, to create chemical distance from the past, to achieve numbness that couldn't be found through psychological means alone. Night terrors struck at 3 a.m, with clockwork regularity. This timing wasn't coincidental, 3 a.m. was, when Hitler often summoned bodyguards for the rambling monologues that could last for hours, when he couldn't sleep, and required an audience for his thoughts. even if that audience consisted of exhausted men who had to maintain alert readiness for security duties the following day. The bodyguard's internal clocks remained calibrated to Hitler's insomnia years after his death, their bodies jerking awake at 3 a.m., hearts racing, fear flooding their systems before consciousness could remind them that the man who summoned them was long dead. Johannes Junge jumped from a fourth-floor window in Hamburg in 1946. He left behind a diary whose entries documented his psychological deterioration with disturbing clarity. Early pages described his capture by British forces, interrogation by military intelligence, release after authorities determined he had committed no war crimes that could be prosecuted under existing legal frameworks. Later pages showed cognitive fracturing sentences that began coherently and dissolved into word salad, drawings of burning children in margins, repeated phrases like, "I see them when I close my eyes," written hundreds of times across single pages. His final entry, written the day of his death, contained only one sentence: "Closing my eyes doesn't work anymore." Whatever barriers he had constructed to separate himself from memory had finally collapsed, leaving him unable to escape what he had witnessed even through sleep. The window offered a final exit, the only door that remained open when all others had closed. Those who survived learned to construct elaborate justifications that protected their self-conception from the implications of their service. They were simple soldiers who followed orders as if following orders exempted them from moral judgment. They knew nothing about concentration camps, as if ignorance achieved through willful blindness deserved credit. They only protected Hitler's person as if protecting someone enabled them to commit atrocities didn't make the protector complicit in those atrocities. These justifications had internal logic that collapsed only under external pressure. Left alone, the bodyguards could maintain these fictions indefinitely, could convince themselves that they bore no responsibility beyond performing their assigned duties. But when questioned by investigators, when confronted with evidence of what they had witnessed and enabled, the justifications showed their fractures. Yet admitting complicity meant accepting guilt, and guilt threatened psychological survival. So they doubled down, refined their justifications, added layers of rationalization that protected the core belief that they were not monsters, not criminals, just men who had been caught in circumstances beyond their control and had done what anyone would have done in their position. Their wives told different stories. Women who lived with these men, who shared beds and meals and daily intimacies, reported husbands who screamed about smoke and ash in their sleep, who couldn't enter rooms with closed doors without panic attacks that left them gasping, who flinched when they smelled gasoline, the scent triggering memories of burning bodies in the Reich Chancellery garden, who drank until consciousness dissolved because sober awareness was unbearable. The wives learned not to ask questions. Marriages existed in carefully maintained silence, questions that might shatter fragile equilibrium left unspoken. Histories, acknowledged only through symptoms rather than confession. Children grew up sensing darkness their fathers wouldn't name, intuiting that something terrible lived in their family's past, but receiving no confirmation, no context, no framework for understanding the free-floating anxiety that pervaded their homes. Rochus Misch's son didn't learn about his father's role in the Reich until reading about it in a newspaper in 1964, 2 decades after the war's end. The article described Misch's position as Hitler's telephone operator, detailed his presence in the bunker during the final days, identified him as one of the last living witnesses to Hitler's suicide. The son confronted his father with the newspaper, demanding explanation, and Misch reportedly sat in silence for over an hour before responding with a single sentence: "I was there, but I was not them." The distinction between being present and being responsible, between witnessing and participating, would define the rest of their relationship. The son never fully accepted his father's position, never agreed that proximity didn't imply complicity. But he didn't sever contact either, maintaining relationship while carrying suspicion and anger that manifested in conversations that circled endlessly around unresolvable questions of guilt and responsibility. Families fractured under the pressure of unspoken truth. Divorce rates among the bodyguards exceeded 70% in documented cases. Marriages couldn't survive the weight of secrets that filled rooms like invisible smoke, that demanded acknowledgement but couldn't bear exposure. Children often left home at the earliest opportunity, seeking distance from the oppressive atmosphere they couldn't name but couldn't escape while living under their fathers' roofs. The bodyguards who maintained family connections did so by constructing rigid boundaries around the past. "We don't talk about that" became a family law enforced through silence and subject changes and the unspoken threat that asking too many questions might shatter something essential. Families existed in a perpetual present, disconnected from history, as if the fathers had been born in 1945 with no previous existence to explain or defend. But the past wasn't containable. It leaked through in behaviors and symptoms, in reactions disproportionate to triggers, in absences that spoke louder than words. A bodyguard who couldn't watch films showing fire. Another who left restaurants if German radio broadcasts played music from the 30s and 40s. A third who kept every light in his house burning through the night because darkness reminded him of the bunker, of spaces without natural light, of being buried alive beneath tons of concrete and earth. The weight of secrets created its own prison. Soviet labor camps had walls and guards and defined sentences, but the psychological prison the bodyguards constructed through secrecy had no walls that could be touched, no guards that could be seen, no sentence with a defined end. They served life terms in prisons of their own construction, trapped by knowledge they couldn't share and couldn't forget, isolated even when surrounded by family, because the truth of who they had been remained quarantined in silence. Some sought redemption through religion, attending church with newfound fervor, praying with intensity that made other congregants uncomfortable, seeking forgiveness from God because human forgiveness seemed impossible to obtain. But religious consolation proved elusive for most. Pastors who heard their confessions when they confessed at all struggled to provide absolution for participation in genocide. Traditional frameworks of sin and repentance didn't scale to atrocity. How many Hail Marys equal complicity in mass murder? What penance balances the books when the debt is measured in millions of dead? Others tried to make amends through charity, through service to others, through living exemplary post-war lives that might somehow balance the scales of their earlier participation in evil. They volunteered at hospitals, donated to relief organizations, helped refugees rebuild lives in post-war Germany. But the math never worked. No amount of good deeds added up to redemption when the original crimes exceeded calculation. They were trying to fill an infinite void with finite actions, and the void remained. A few attempted suicide. Some succeeded, like Johannes Junger jumping from his window. Others failed, like Karl Tenazek, whose 1943 attempt during the war was followed by a second attempt in 1951, this time with sleeping pills rather than razors. He survived both, lived into his 80s, and died naturally in a nursing home where staff described him as the quietest resident they had ever cared, for a man who seemed to be waiting for death with the patience of someone who had been ready for decades. The bodyguards, who survived longest, those who lived into the 1990s and 2000s, who reached ages of 80 and 90 and beyond, faced a final reckoning that biology imposed. As their brains aged, as the prefrontal cortex that governed inhibition began to fail, the secrets they had guarded for decades began to leak out. They started talking, not from conscious choice but from neurological necessity, the machinery of silence breaking down as surely as their bodies declined. And what emerged, in those final confessions made to journalists and historians and families who finally heard truths they had suspected but never confirmed, rewrote accepted history. The bodyguards had been there, had seen what even extensive investigation hadn't uncovered, had known details that died when other witnesses died but survived in their memories, waiting for the moment when the guards finally came down and the truth could emerge. Tomorrow, we'll hear those deathbed confessions, the revelations, that came when death approached and secrets lost their power. Old men, failing in bodies that had carried guilty knowledge for decades, finally speaking truths that changed our understanding of history's darkest chapter. The scattered seeds had taken root across the world, growing into twisted trees whose branches bore poisoned fruit. But those trees, in their final seasons, would drop seeds of a different kind, not poison but antidote, not silence but testimony, not justification but admission. The long silence was ending. The confessions were about to begin. Hans Bauer lay in a Munich hospital bed in 2005, his kidneys failing, his body shutting down with the systematic progression that marks the end of a long life. 91 years old, his mind remained sharp even as his organs surrendered, and he knew with certainty that he had perhaps weeks remaining, maybe less. A journalist sat beside his bed, recording device visible on the nightstand, waiting to hear what decades of silence had concealed. Before we listen to these final testimonies, understand what you're about to witness. The breaking of silence that lasted 60 years. These confessions don't absolve, but they illuminate. They show us how ordinary men carried extraordinary guilt and what emerged when death finally made honesty possible. Tomorrow, we'll examine what these revelations teach us about preventing future atrocity. Stay with this journey, we're almost through. Bauer had refused interviews for decades. He had written a memoir in 1956, carefully edited to present himself as a simple pilot who served Germany rather than Hitler, who knew nothing of camps or killings, who flew aircraft without understanding where those flights led or what they enabled. The memoir was a masterpiece of omission, full of technical details about aviation and strategic movements, empty of moral reckoning or uncomfortable truths. But now, with death approaching, something shifted. Perhaps it was the neurological changes that accompany systemic organ failure, the way failing kidneys allow toxins to build up in the bloodstream and affect brain chemistry. Perhaps it was the simple human recognition that you cannot take secrets into death and that unburdening becomes possible when consequences no longer matter. Or perhaps, after carrying weight for 60 years, he was simply tired of the burden and wanted to set it down before the final darkness came. "I need to tell you about the flight over Auschwitz," he said to the journalist, his voice barely above a whisper, but his words carrying weight that filled the hospital room like a presence. "We flew there in 1942. Hitler wanted to see it." The journalist leaned forward, recorder light blinking red, capturing words that would force historians to revise their understanding of what Hitler knew and when he knew it. Bauer's confession continued in fragments, his energy waning between sentences. Nurses, entering periodically to check vitals and adjust medications that could extend his life by days but no longer by weeks. Hitler had ordered a detour on a flight to the Eastern Front, not random, not accidental, deliberate. He wanted to observe what Bauer called the solution in progress, using the euphemism that Nazi leadership employed to avoid naming genocide directly, even among themselves. They descended to low altitude, low enough to see details that high-altitude reconnaissance would miss, low enough that Bauer could describe what spread beneath them. The Auschwitz-Birkenau complex covered square kilometers barracks arranged in precise geometric patterns, rail lines converging like arteries bringing blood to a heart, the selection ramps where arrivals were sorted into columns that determined immediate death or temporary survival. Smoke rose from crematoria that operated continuously, chimneys that never stopped exhaling, the particulate remains of human beings transformed to ash. Bauer circled for 20 minutes. He watched Hitler watch, observed his passenger with the professional attention a pilot learns to apply to passengers whose behavior might affect flight safety or require response. Hitler pressed close to the window, his breath fogging the glass, his expression what Bauer described as detached observation, not horror, not satisfaction exactly, but the clinical interest of someone examining a complex operation. He watched it like a tourist viewing a monument, Bauer whispered, and the journalist understood they had just recorded a phrase that would echo through historical analysis for generations. The comparison was perfect, and damning tourists look at monuments with aesthetic appreciation, educational interest, perhaps pride in human achievement. They see completed works rather than ongoing processes, architecture rather than suffering. Hitler viewed Auschwitz the same way, Bauer insisted, as if the camp was a finished project to be observed, rather than an ongoing atrocity consuming thousands of lives daily. When asked why he had never revealed this before, Why he had let historians believe Hitler might not have directly witnessed the camps, Bauer's answer was simple and terrible. Who would have believed me, and what would it change? He was dead. Germany was destroyed. My testimony would only have made my own life worse. The calculus was honest, at least. Speaking earlier would have brought nothing but punishment. Soviet interrogators might have tortured him more severely for withholding information. German prosecutors might have charged him with complicity. Public opinion would have turned him into a symbol of collective guilt. Silence protected him. Only now, when death approached and protection no longer mattered, could truth emerge. Bauer died 6 weeks after the interview. The journalist published the confession with full context, and historians absorbed this new evidence into their understanding of Hitler's direct knowledge and observation of the Holocaust. It wasn't that historians had doubted Hitler orchestrated the genocide, the documentary evidence for that was overwhelming. But Bauer's confession confirmed Hitler's direct visual observation, his choice to witness rather than maintain plausible deniability, his tourist-like detachment while viewing industrialized murder. Rochus Misch broke his silence differently. He lived longer than most of the bodyguards, reaching 96 years old, dying in 2013 as the last surviving witness who had been in the Führer bunker during Hitler's final days. For decades, he maintained minimal public presence, giving occasional interviews that repeated the same sanitized narrative about his service as a communications operator who simply connected calls without responsibility for their content. But in 2008, 5 years before his death, he agreed to an extended interview series with a historian who had spent years building trust, demonstrating through patience and non-judgment that he wanted understanding rather than condemnation. Misch, perhaps sensing his own approaching mortality, perhaps simply worn down by the weight of secrets, began talking in ways he never had before. He revealed that Hitler's final phone call wasn't to military commanders or government officials, but to Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister who remained in the bunker with his family, who would murder his own children rather than let them survive the Reich's collapse. The call lasted less than a minute. Hitler said simply, "It is time," and Goebbels replied, "Yes, my Führer." Then Hitler hung up, handed the phone to Misch, and walked to his private quarters where, 30 minutes later, he would shoot himself. It is time. 2 words that ended 12 years of dictatorship, concluded a war that had killed over 60 million people, closed a chapter of human history that had seen evil on scales previously unimaginable. Misch had connected that call, heard those words, understood their meaning, and carried them in silence for 63 years, before finally speaking them into a recording device in a Berlin apartment where the last witness to Hitler's end sat surrounded by photographs and memorabilia from a life that spanned a century. But the detail that haunted Misch most, the revelation that seemed to carry more weight than anything else he confessed, concerned Eva Braun's final words. As she prepared to bite the cyanide capsule, she had spoken to one of the women present in the bunker, asking that a message be delivered to her sister Gretel. "Tell my sister I died without fear." Misch described those words with a precision that suggested he had replayed them mentally thousands of times. She wanted her sister to know she wasn't afraid, he said, and then he began crying, a 91-year-old man, weeping in a Berlin apartment, tears running down his face while he explained that Eva Braun's courage in facing death she had chosen was the thing that broke him, that made him understand the full tragedy of what he had witnessed. It's worth pausing here to examine why this particular detail affected Misch so profoundly. In a story filled with mass murder and atrocity, why would one woman's final message to her sister carry such weight? Perhaps because it was a moment of pure human connection amid orchestrated evil, a sister thinking of a sister, love persisting even at death's threshold. Or perhaps because Eva Braun's choice to die with Hitler, however misguided, however tragic, was authentic in ways that much of what Misch had witnessed was not. She wasn't following orders or protecting herself or calculating advantage. She was making a choice from love or loyalty or simply commitment to the path she had chosen years earlier. Whatever the reason, Misch's confession of Eva's final words provided historians with a detail that humanized her in ways previous accounts had not. She became not just Hitler's mistress or the woman who died beside him, but a sister who wanted her sibling to know she had faced death with courage. The message didn't redeem her choices, didn't erase her complicity through association, but it complicated the narrative in ways that forced more nuanced understanding. Heinrich Doering, groundskeeper at the Berghof, Hitler's Bavarian mountain retreat, made his confession from a nursing home bed in 1999. He was 93 years old, suffering from advanced dementia that made his testimony unreliable in legal contexts, but compelling as evidence of what he believed he remembered. His confession came not to a journalist or historian but to a nurse who recorded it because she recognized its potential importance, even if she couldn't verify its accuracy. Doering claimed that in May 1945, as Allied forces approached the Berghof, he received orders to burn documents thousands of pages, stored in filing cabinets and safes, classified materials that couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. He spent 3 days feeding paper into fires, burning until smoke-filled rooms and his lungs ached from inhaling ash. Most of the documents concerned routine administration, supply orders, staff schedules, security protocols. But some, according to Doering's confession, described weapons programs that went beyond anything Allied intelligence had discovered. Weapons that would have killed everyone on Earth, he said, and the nurse who heard this confession didn't know whether to believe him or dismiss it as dementia-fueled fantasy. Doering provided no specifics, he couldn't remember details or perhaps had never understood the technical content, but he insisted with the fervor of someone desperate to be believed that he had burned documents describing weapons capable of global destruction, and that his burning them might have saved humanity from technologies that should never have been developed. Historians have debated Doering's confession extensively without reaching consensus. Nazi Germany did conduct advanced weapons research, the V-2 rockets, early jet aircraft, chemical weapons that were never deployed. Nuclear weapons research existed but never approached the success of Allied programs. Could there have been other programs, more secret, more dangerous? Or was Doering's confession the confused memory of an old man whose failing mind conflated different things he had witnessed across years of service? We may never know with certainty. The documents, if they existed as Doering described, were destroyed. No corroborating evidence has emerged, but his confession remains in the historical record as a troubling possibility that some Nazi weapons programs were so dangerous their complete destruction was necessary for human survival, and that an elderly groundskeeper carried knowledge of that destruction for 54 years before finally speaking it to a nurse in a nursing home where no one fully believed him. Heinz Lingje's confession came posthumously through a memoir published after his death. He had written it in the 1980s, a manuscript he kept private until his death in 2003, when his family discovered it and eventually agreed to publication. The memoir was different from his earlier ghost-written autobiography, more honest, more detailed, more willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths he had previously obscured. One of the most significant revelations concerned Hitler's daily drug regimen. Linge had been present for many of Dr. Theodor Morell's injections, had helped prepare Hitler for the treatments, had observed the immediate and cumulative effects. He described in clinical detail what Hitler received: methamphetamine for energy, testosterone for vitality, opiates for pain that increasingly plagued him, and extracts from bull testicles based on Morell's bizarre theory that animal vigor could be transferred through chemistry. By 1945, according to Linge's memoir, Hitler received up to 5 injections daily. His days were structured around these treatments: waking injection to start function, midday injection to maintain energy, evening injection to allow sleep that wouldn't come naturally. The drugs didn't just treat symptoms. They became essential for basic function. Without Morell's cocktails, Hitler couldn't eat without nausea, couldn't sleep without nightmares, couldn't think without racing anxiety that paralyzed decision-making. Linge's description revealed Hitler not as the superhuman figure propaganda presented, but as a pharmacologically animated corpse, a man whose natural systems had been so disrupted by drugs that he required constant chemical intervention to maintain even degraded function. The portrait was both humanizing and dehumanizing. Humanizing because it showed vulnerability and weakness. Dehumanizing because it suggested Hitler's decisions in the final years came from a mind so altered by drugs that questions of sanity and responsibility became impossibly complex. The memoir also revealed that Hitler wasn't vegetarian for ethical reasons, but because meat reminded him of corpses. After walking a battlefield in World War I and seeing bodies in various states of decay, Hitler developed an association between meat and death that made eating flesh nauseating. Linge described Hitler explaining this, once after too much wine loosened his usual guardedness, saying he couldn't separate schnitzel from soldiers, couldn't look at roasted chicken without remembering rotting men. This detail forced reconsideration of one of the most commonly cited facts about Hitler, his vegetarianism, often presented as evidence of his supposed sensitivity, or even as dark irony given his orchestration of mass murder. But Linge's revelation suggested the vegetarianism stemmed not from compassion but from psychological damage, from trauma that created an association Hitler couldn't overcome. It was a detail that complicated without redeeming, that showed damage without excusing evil. Perhaps most importantly, Linge's memoir revealed that Hitler's suicide wasn't spontaneous, but planned for weeks. Hitler had practiced the method holding a pistol to his temple while preparing to bite a cyanide capsule, ensuring he could coordinate the actions, eliminating the possibility of surviving the gunshot only to choke on vomit from cyanide, or failing to shoot after the capsule released its poison. Linge had walked in on Hitler practicing at least twice, finding his Führer standing before a mirror with a pistol pressed to his head, the capsule visible between his teeth, rehearsing death with the same attention to detail he had applied to everything else. This revelation changed understanding of Hitler's final hours, from spontaneous despair to deliberate choreography. He wasn't overcome by circumstances and making a panicked choice. He was executing a plan developed over weeks, refined through practice, performed when he judged the timing optimal. Even in death, he sought control, sought to determine exactly how and when his end came, sought to deny his enemies any say in his fate. These confessions, Bauer's, Misch's, Döring's, Linge's, and others made in the final years and after death, rewrote accepted history. They filled gaps that documentary evidence couldn't bridge, provided eyewitness testimony to events and conversations that no written record captured, revealed the intimate details that transform abstract history into human experience. But they also raised difficult questions about testimony and truth. How reliable are memories preserved for decades under the weight of secrecy and shame? How much do failing brains and approaching death distort recollection? How can we verify confessions that come too late for cross-examination, that emerge when most other witnesses are dead, and corroboration becomes impossible? Historians approach these late confessions with appropriate skepticism, cross-referencing them against known facts, looking for internal consistency and external corroboration. Where the confessions align with documented evidence or explain previously mysterious gaps, they're incorporated into historical understanding. Where they stand alone or contradict established facts, they're treated as possibilities rather than certainties, annotated with appropriate caveats about the circumstances of their emergence. Yet, even with these limitations, the deathbed confessions provided something invaluable: the perspective of those who stood closest to power, who witnessed what documents don't record, who carried knowledge that died when they died unless they chose to speak before the end. Their confessions, whatever their limitations, offer windows into a world that would otherwise remain partially obscured, events we would understand less fully without their final testimonies. The pattern that emerged across the confessions revealed how dying loosens tongues. Neurologists studying the phenomenon found that approaching death reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region governing inhibition and social restraint. As this region fails, secrets become harder to keep. The effort required to maintain silence exceeds available capacity, and truth emerges not from conscious choice but from neurological necessity. The bodyguard's confessions weren't primarily moral, they weren't seeking forgiveness or trying to make amends. They were biological, the result of brains that could no longer maintain the walls that had separated knowledge from speech for decades. This doesn't diminish their value. Truth that emerges from necessity is still truth. Confessions that come from failing inhibition still provide information that advances understanding, but it does force recognition of a sobering reality. If these men hadn't lived long enough for their brains to fail, if they had died younger while inhibition remained intact, many of these secrets would have died with them. Future generations would have lost knowledge that only emerged because bodies outlasted the capacity for silence. We are dependent on the accidents of longevity and neurology for access to truth that conscious choice would have continued concealing. As the last of the bodyguards died in 2013, the final witness from the bunker and era ended. No living person remained who had stood beside Hitler during the Reich's final days, who had heard his voice and witnessed his actions directly rather than through documentary evidence or secondary accounts. History was complete. In one sense, all the primary sources were gone, all the witnesses dead. But in another sense, history was just beginning its long work of analysis and interpretation, of extracting meaning from the evidence the bodyguards left behind, of understanding what their testimonies and confessions revealed about humanity's capacity for evil and complicity. Tomorrow, in our final chapter, we'll examine what these stories teach us about preventing future atrocity, about recognizing the warning signs before dissent becomes unstoppable, about the patterns these bodyguards illuminated through their service and eventual testimony. Their confessions don't just tell us what happened in the past. They provide antibodies against future infection, warning systems that might help humanity recognize and resist similar dissents before they reach the depths the bodyguards witnessed. The tongues have been loosened. The confessions are complete. What remains is learning from what they revealed, extracting lessons that justify the discomfort of having witnessed these men's testimonies and transformations. The education continues, even as the educators have finally fallen silent forever. The bodyguards are dead now, every one of them. Rochus Misch, the last survivor, died in 2013 at age 96, taking with him the final living connection to Hitler's bunker and the Reich's collapse. But their testimonies remain, preserved in interviews and memoirs and confessions, providing raw material for a question that matters more than historical curiosity. What do their stories teach us about preventing future atrocity? This is our final chapter together, and it's the most important. Everything we've witnessed, the selection, the paranoia, the complicity, the silence, the confessions, points toward patterns we must recognize if we hope to prevent repetition. Share this widely. The education we've undertaken together matters only if it changes how we see the world and respond to emerging threats. Let's finish this journey. The bodyguard's testimonies revealed something terrifying in its simplicity. Orchestrating genocide required no monsters. It required only ordinary men subjected to specific conditions that transformed them, incrementally from decent citizens into instruments of evil. If we can identify those conditions and the transformation process they produced, we gain tools for recognition that might allow intervention before dissent becomes irreversible. The formula that emerged from analyzing the bodyguard's experiences can be expressed almost mathematically, though the precision of mathematics belies the human horror at its core. Take 1 part economic desperation, the crushing poverty and hyperinflation that devastated Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. Add 2 parts, nationalism, the humiliation of Versailles, and the longing for restored greatness. Multiply by charismatic authority, a leader who promises simple solutions and demands absolute loyalty. Divide by individual moral courage, the willingness to resist authority and risk consequences. The result equals participation in atrocity. The mathematical expression doesn't mean the outcome was inevitable. History isn't algebra. Changing any variable changes results. But it does suggest that certain combinations of conditions create environments where evil becomes statistically likely, where the percentage of people who will participate in atrocity increases from near zero under normal conditions to percentages high enough to enable genocide. The bodyguard's confessions exposed the exact pressure points where human morality collapses. The timeline was surprisingly consistent across testimonies, approximately 3 months, from initial recruitment to first participation in clearly immoral acts. 3 months for the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler to transform soldiers who might have questioned orders into men who would kill fellow Germans during the Night of Long Knives without hesitation. The progression involved 7 witnessed atrocities on average before participation became normalized. 7 times watching violence without consequence. 7 instances of seeing others commit acts you would have considered unthinkable before witnessing them as routine. After 7 exposures, the 8th became easier. The mind adapts, recalibrates what constitutes normal, adjusts baselines downward until what once seemed monstrous appears merely as another day's work. The dehumanizing rhetoric that enabled this adaptation required constant exposure exceeding 4 hours daily. This wasn't casual propaganda consumed occasionally, but systematic indoctrination, daily briefings, constant radio broadcasts, conversations with comrades who reinforced the narrative, an environment where dissenting thoughts had nowhere to find purchase because contradicting voices had been systematically eliminated. Think about what 4 hours daily means. That's the equivalent of a part-time job devoted entirely to hearing that certain groups aren't fully human, that violence against them is necessary, that your service is protecting something valuable that these subhumans threaten. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The repetition becomes neurological, carving channels in the brain that make certain thoughts flow more easily, while others meet resistance that makes them exhausting to maintain. Modern psychologists studying the bodyguard's testimonies identified specific cognitive patterns that enabled complicity. The first was diffusion of responsibility, a psychological phenomenon where individuals in groups feel less personal accountability because blame can be distributed across multiple actors. No single bodyguard pulled all the triggers, signed all the orders, made all the decisions. Each one participated in small pieces of a larger operation, allowing them to minimize their individual contribution by focusing on how many others were involved. "I was just one man among thousands," becomes the refrain. "If I hadn't done it, someone else would have." These statements are factually true and morally bankrupt simultaneously. Yes, the Holocaust would have proceeded without any particular bodyguard's participation. But it proceeded because enough individuals decided their personal participation didn't matter, that they were drops in an ocean and therefore bore no responsibility for the ocean's destination. The second pattern was routinization, the transformation of atrocity into procedure through repetition and bureaucratization. When murder becomes paperwork, when genocide gets reduced to logistics and efficiency metrics, the emotional weight that should prevent participation gets buried under administrative mundane. You're not killing people, you're processing forms. You're not enabling mass murder, you're ensuring communication systems function properly. You're not protecting history's greatest monster, you're performing security duties according to established protocols. Routinization is perhaps the most insidious mechanism because it requires no explicit justification. You don't have to convince yourself that genocide is good or even necessary. You simply have to focus on doing your job well, maintaining professional standards, following procedures. The moral weight gets distributed so thoroughly across the bureaucratic system that no individual point bears enough pressure to break through the routine's protective coating. The third pattern was doubling the creation of a second self that could function in moral darkness while preserving a primary self that maintained normal human emotions and relationships. The bodyguards literally split themselves, maintaining one identity that stood silent while genocide was discussed at dinner parties, and a separate identity that played with children and kissed wives goodnight. These two selves existed in careful isolation, each pretending the other didn't exist, walls between them maintained through psychological effort that eventually proved unsustainable, but worked long enough to enable years of participation. Doubling allowed the bodyguards to avoid cognitive dissonance that might have forced choice. If you're only one person, the contradiction between loving father and genocide enabler creates pressure that demands resolution. Either change your behavior or revise your self-concept. But if you're two people, The contradiction exists between selves rather than within a self, and the psychological pressure dissipates. The work self and home self can coexist because they've been placed in separate mental compartments that don't communicate. The bodyguard's children and grandchildren carry markers of trauma that persist across generations. Medical research examining descendants of Holocaust perpetrators, including the bodyguards, found elevated cortisol levels, increased susceptibility to anxiety disorders, and altered stress responses compared to control populations. This isn't just psychological inheritance, but potentially epigenetic, changes in gene expression patterns that can be passed to offspring. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but the evidence is clear. Trauma affects not just those who experience it directly, but those connected to them through biology and family systems. The bodyguard's grandchildren, born decades after the war, carry in their bodies the residue of atrocities their grandfathers witnessed and enabled. Evil echoes not just through history but through DNA, marking generations that had no direct connection to the original acts. Museums and educational institutions now use the bodyguard's testimonies to teach recognition patterns, the graduated normalization of violence, the slow erosion of empathy, the transformation of neighbors into enemies. The Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with rhetoric that dehumanized, laws that excluded, violence that went unpunished because authorities sanctioned it. Each step prepared ground for the next, creating conditions where the previously unthinkable became not just possible but inevitable. The bodyguard's experiences illuminate this progression with painful clarity. They watched the descent happen in real time, witnessed each stage as it unfolded, saw how each compromise enabled the next until they stood beside a man directing the murder of millions and couldn't remember how they had arrived at that position. Their testimonies serve as detailed maps of the descent's topology, marking the landmarks and decision points where intervention might have redirected the path. Understanding these markers doesn't guarantee prevention. Knowledge doesn't automatically translate into action, especially when action requires courage and sacrifice. But ignorance guarantees repetition. If we don't recognize the patterns, we cannot intervene. If we don't understand how ordinary men become instruments of atrocity, we cannot guard against our own transformation when similar conditions emerge. Rokas Misch's apartment in Berlin became an unwilling shrine in his final years. Neo-Nazis left flowers outside his door, treating him as a connection to a regime they venerated, as if proximity to Hitler conferred some twisted honor rather than moral contamination. Misch called the police repeatedly to remove the flowers, to stop the pilgrimages, but they continued until his death. Even in his 90s, even after decades of silence broken by final confessions, he couldn't escape association with what he had witnessed and enabled. Yet his final interview contained a warning more valuable than any flowers left by Nazi sympathizers. Speaking to a journalist just months before his death, Misch said, "It happened to us gradually, so slowly we didn't notice until we were trapped. Watch for the gradual changes. They're the most dangerous." This warning deserves emphasis because it contradicts our comfortable assumptions about how evil emerges. We imagine tyranny announces itself with dramatic gestures, that fascism arrives in jackboots and declares its intentions openly. But the bodyguard's testimonies reveal different mechanics, evil that seeps rather than crashes, that normalizes through repetition, that becomes entrenched before opposition can organize because each individual step seems too small to merit resistance. Gradual change is dangerous precisely because it doesn't trigger alarms. When temperature increases slowly, you adjust without noticing. When rights erode incrementally, each loss seems manageable. When violence escalates by degrees, you recalibrate what constitutes normal. By the time you recognize you're in boiling water, your capacity to jump out has been compromised by the very process you failed to notice. The bodyguard's confessions serve as fossil evidence of human moral flexibility, preserved examples of how civilization's membrane stretches before tearing. Their stories show that the membrane is thinner than we'd like to believe, that the distance between decent person and genocide enabler can be crossed in months rather than years when conditions align and pressures mount. But their confessions also reveal that the membrane, while thin, isn't fictional. Some men resisted even under pressure, Some refused orders even when refusal meant death. Some maintained moral clarity even when everyone around them was losing theirs. These resistors were rare, perhaps 5% of those exposed to similar conditions, but they existed. Their existence proves that compliance wasn't inevitable, that different choices were possible even if difficult and dangerous. The Bodyguard's stories echo through subsequent genocides with haunting consistency. Rwanda, in 1994, where Hutus, who had been neighbors and friends to Tutsis, became murderers within weeks of systematic dehumanization and calls to violence. Bosnia, in the early 1990s, where ethnic cleansing followed patterns remarkably similar to Nazi methodology. Cambodia, in the late 70s, where the Khmer Rouge transformed society through brutality enabled by ordinary people who adapted to atrocity, with the same cognitive mechanisms the bodyguards employed. The repetition isn't coincidence, but evidence of underlying patterns in human psychology and social dynamics. The same vulnerabilities exist in every population. The same mechanisms can be exploited by those seeking power through fear and division. The same dissent can occur anywhere if conditions align and opposition fails to mobilize before transformation becomes complete. This universality is both terrifying and useful. Terrifying because it means no society is immune, no population incapable of descending into atrocity if subjected to the right, or rather, wrong, combination of pressures. Useful because patterns that repeat can be recognized, and recognition enables intervention. The bodyguards gave us the map. Whether we use it determines if their testimonies serve any purpose beyond historical record. The last surviving bodyguard died in 2013, but their testimonies remain active ingredients in humanity's immune system against tyranny. Just as exposure to weakened pathogens can create antibodies that prevent future infection, exposure to the bodyguard stories can create psychological antibodies, recognition patterns, and moral frameworks that help identify and resist similar descents before they reach the depths these men witnessed. Educational programs built around Holocaust testimony, including the bodyguard's confessions, demonstrate measurable effects. Students who engage deeply with perpetrator testimony show increased resistance to dehumanizing rhetoric, improved ability to recognize propaganda techniques, and greater willingness to intervene when they witness injustice. The effect isn't perfect. Education doesn't create invulnerability, but it moves the needle, increases the percentage of people who will resist rather than comply when pressured to participate in harm. This is why we've undertaken this difficult journey together, why we've spent 7 chapters walking beside men whose service enabled atrocity. Not to wallow in darkness or to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to extract lessons that might prevent recurrence. The bodyguards' testimonies are valuable not because they're interesting, though they are, but because they're instructive. They show us what to watch for, what to resist, how to recognize dissent before it becomes irreversible. The warning signs the bodyguards identified through their confessions form a checklist we can apply to contemporary situations. Dehumanizing rhetoric that intensifies rather than moderates. When political leaders consistently describe other groups as vermin, disease, or existential threats, when metaphors shift from disagreement to infestation, warning lights should flash. Language precedes action. Dehumanization in speech enables dehumanization in policy. Progressive normalization of violence. When assaults on marginalized groups go unpunished or receive tacit official approval, when authorities respond to violence with explanations rather than enforcement, when each incident is treated as isolated rather than part of a pattern, conditions are being established for escalation. Loyalty tests that require moral compromise. When organizations demand actions that violate ethical boundaries as proof of commitment, when advancement requires participation in questionable activities, when questioning orders becomes evidence of disloyalty, the machinery of atrocity is being constructed. Systematic exclusion of target groups from legal protection. When certain populations lose rights incrementally, when laws create categories of people to whom normal protections don't apply, when dehumanizing rhetoric gets encoded into policy, dissent has begun and will accelerate without intervention. Concentration of power without accountability. When leaders surround themselves with loyalists rather than advisors willing to dissent, when institutional checks on authority are systematically dismantled, when questioning becomes dangerous rather than valued, the conditions for atrocity are being established. None of these signs alone guarantees genocide will follow, but their combination, their mutual reinforcement, creates environments where atrocity becomes statistically likely. The bodyguards watched these conditions develop in real time and adapted rather than resisted. Their testimonies serve as warnings about what adaptation costs, not just those harmed by atrocity, but those who enable it, who discover too late that complicity destroys the complicit as surely as the victims. So, what do we do with this knowledge? The bodyguards' testimonies provide diagnosis, but don't automatically generate cure. Understanding how evil emerges doesn't make stopping it easy or safe. Resistance carries costs, economic, social, sometimes physical. Those who recognized the Nazi regime's evil early and spoke out paid with careers, freedom, lives. Asking people to accept such costs is asking a great deal, but the alternative cost, the cost of non-resistance, of adaptation, of becoming the next generation of bodyguards standing beside whatever new atrocity emerges, is even higher. It's paid not just in external consequences, but internal corruption, the transformation of self into something unrecognizable, the decades of weight the bodyguards carried and the poisoned legacy they left their children. The choice, when it comes, and history suggests it will come, if not in our generation, then in subsequent ones, isn't between safety and danger. It's between different forms of danger, different costs, different compromises. The bodyguards chose the compromise that seemed safest in the moment: follow orders, maintain silence, prioritize personal and family survival over abstract moral principles. That choice bought them temporary security at permanent cost to their souls and devastating cost to millions of victims. Different choices were possible. Some Germans resisted even when resistance meant death. Some refused to participate even when refusal meant losing everything. Some maintained their humanity, even when surrounding circumstances seemed designed to strip humanity away. They were rare, but they existed, and their existence proves that compliance wasn't inevitable. The bodyguards' confessions give us something precious: advanced knowledge of what dissent looks like, detailed maps of the territory between civilization and atrocity, marked routes showing where intervention might divert trajectory before momentum becomes unstoppable. This knowledge carries responsibility. Having learned from their experiences, having witnessed through their testimonies how ordinary men enable extraordinary evil, we cannot claim ignorance when similar patterns emerge. The echoes of the bodyguard's service reverberate still, not just in history books but in contemporary politics and social dynamics. The patterns they illuminated remain active, waiting for conditions that might call them forth. Dehumanizing rhetoric finds new targets. Violence gets normalized through repetition. Loyalty gets tested through moral compromise. Power concentrates without accountability. The machinery they served was dismantled in 1945, but its blueprints survived, available to anyone willing to study how atrocity gets organized and enabled. Our responsibility is recognition and resistance. When we see the patterns emerging, we must name them. When we witness dehumanization, we must refuse its logic. When we're asked to compromise morally for organizational loyalty, we must decline even at cost. When violence gets normalized, we must maintain the clarity that assault is assault, regardless of who the victim is or what justifications are offered. This sounds simple, but isn't easy. The bodyguards weren't stupid or uniquely evil. They were human beings responding to pressures and incentives in ways that made sense from within or their circumstances. Resisting those pressures requires courage that most of us hope we'll never need to demonstrate, because hoping suggests we believe we might not possess it when tested. But the bodyguards' testimonies remind us that the test comes gradually, that by the time dramatic courage is required, most people have already been compromised through small compliances that seemed harmless in isolation. The time for resistance isn't when you're asked to participate in atrocity by then. The path to that point has been paved with choices that made refusal progressively more difficult. The time for resistance is when you're asked to dehumanize others through language, when you're encouraged to see violence as acceptable against certain groups, when you're told that loyalty requires silencing your conscience. These are the choices that matter, the small resistances that prevent the gradual descent the bodyguards warned about. If enough people refuse at these early stages, if enough voices say this is wrong before it becomes dangerous to say so, descent can be interrupted. Not easily, not without cost, but possibly which is more than the bodyguards' victims had when the machinery of genocide reached full operation. The bodyguards are gone now, their voices silenced by death after decades of silence chosen for self-protection. But their confessions remain, recorded and preserved, available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of learning from perpetrators as well as victims, of understanding how evil operates so we might recognize and resist it. This has been a dark journey. 7 chapters walking beside men whose service enabled atrocity, whose silence prolonged injustice, whose confessions came too late to change anything except our understanding. If you've stayed with me through all of it, if you've witnessed what these men witnessed and learned what their testimonies teach, you've done important work. Now comes the harder part, applying those lessons, remaining vigilant for the patterns they illuminated, having the courage to resist when resistance is needed even though it's difficult and costly. The bodyguards showed us the cost of compliance. Resistance carries costs too, but different ones, costs we can look back on without shame, without the weight that destroyed the bodyguards' final years, without legacies that poison descendants. The choice will come. History guarantees it. When it does, remember these men not to excuse what they did but to avoid repeating it. Not to forgive, but to learn. Not to forget, but to ensure their confessions serve the only purpose that justifies the discomfort of having heard them. Prevention of the next atrocity. Protection of the next generation of potential victims. Preservation of our own humanity when pressured to surrender it. The echoes continue. They will never stop reverberating. But whether they echo as warnings or prophecies depends on choices we make when our time comes to choose. The bodyguards chose wrong at every crossroads. Their confessions give us the map. Our responsibility is choosing differently when we reach those same intersections. That's where this story ends, not with resolution or redemption, but with responsibility. The bodyguard's tale is finished. The lessons they taught continue. What we do with those lessons determines whether this journey served any purpose beyond satisfying historical curiosity. Watch for the gradual changes. They're the most dangerous. Resist while resistance is still possible. Remember that ordinary people become instruments of evil through small compromises that seem insignificant until you look back and see the distance traveled. The bodyguards told us this in their final confessions. It's the last gift they gave, wisdom purchased through participation in atrocity, knowledge extracted from complicity. Warnings from men who learned too late what they should have known from the beginning. Don't wait until it's too late. Don't become the next generation's confession. Learn from those who came before, and choose differently when your turn comes to choose. The story ends here. The education continues forever.